In the spring of 1997, authorities in Japan gathered at the northern base of Mount Fuji for what had become a grim annual tradition. They were there to perform a sweep of the Aokigahara forest, a place the locals call the Sea of Trees. Most people see a park, but for the recovery teams it was a biological vault holding the city's secrets. That year they carried a topographic map from 1996 that looked like any other until you saw the dozens of small, hand-drawn X marks scattered across the green ink. Each X represented a place where a trail of white plastic tape had led to a silent conclusion. They didn't know it yet, but the 1997 sweep was about to change everything. Before we head into the deep woods, I want to welcome you. It is good to have you here. Today we are looking at 12 different stories from 1997 and 98, covering everything from mountain disasters to mysteries that still keep investigators awake. If you enjoy these kinds of deep dives, feel free to subscribe and join us for the full series. I would love to hear where you are listening from today, so leave a comment and let me know. Also, if you could tap the like button, it really helps the show reach more people who might be looking for a quiet place to hear a dark story. Just don't get too comfortable. It is a lot easier to find your way into these woods than it is to find your way back out. In 1997, a man named Takahiro was beginning his 15th year as a forest ranger in the Yamanashi prefecture. He was 52 years old, with skin that had been weathered by the sun and eyes that had seen more of the mountain than most people see of their own homes. Takahiro was a man of quiet habits and deep practical knowledge. He grew up in a town close enough to Mount Fuji that the mountain's massive white peak was the first thing he saw every morning. He understood the terrain better than anyone. He knew which routes were slick after a light rain and which caves were safe to enter when the weather turned. To Takahiro, the forest was not a place of mystery. It was a place of work and science. Takahiro's daily routine was steady. He arrived at the ranger station early, checked the weather reports, and then set out with a heavy pack and a clipboard. He spent his days maintaining the designated hiking trails, checking the health of the ancient hemlock and cypress trees, and guiding tourists who came to see the majestic view of the mountain reflecting in Lake Saiko. He took pride in the fact that the Aokigahara forest was a national treasure. It was a place of incredible biological diversity, sitting on a bed of hardened lava from the massive eruption in 864. Because the rock was so porous and filled with air pockets, the forest floor acted like a giant acoustic sponge. It was one of the quietest places on Earth. If you stood still in the middle of the sea of trees, you would notice something strange. There was almost no wind, even on a breezy day. The trees grew so close together that they formed a solid wall against the outside world. There were fewer birds and insects than in other woods, and the sound of your own footsteps would vanish almost as soon as you lifted your foot. For 15 years, Takahiro found peace in that silence. He liked the fact that he could hear himself think. He knew every clearing and every rock formation within the park boundaries. He was responsible for the safety of thousands of visitors, and he took that responsibility seriously. He was the kind of man who would stop to pick up a single piece of litter from a trail. To him, the forest was a living organism. He knew how the moss felt under his boots in every season, and he could identify the age of a tree just by the texture of its bark. He spent his lunch break sitting on the edge of the Narusawa ice cave, eating a simple meal and watching the light change across the canopy. He valued the predictability of the mountain's cycles. One of his most important tasks was monitoring the borders between the official trails and the restricted areas. Because the volcanic rock was so dense with iron, it made magnetic compasses spin and jammed radio signals. It was very easy for an inexperienced hiker to wander off the path and lose their sense of direction within minutes. Once you lost the trail, everything looked the same. In the spring of 1997, the ground was still soft from the winter thaw, and the moss was a vibrant electric green. Takahiro was performing a routine patrol near the Wind Cave, one of the more popular tourist spots. He was checking the wooden signage for any signs of rot or damage. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, and the air smelled of damp pine and wet earth. As he was adjusting a post, he looked past the edge of the official path. About 20 yards into the dense brush, he saw a thin, jagged line of color that did not belong. It was a strand of bright blue plastic ribbon, the kind used for industrial marking. It was tied to a low branch of a cypress tree and seemed to trail off deeper into the restricted zone of the forest. Normally, researchers or surveyors would notify the ranger station if they were marking a site. Takahiro checked his log and saw no such entry. He assumed it might be a hiker who had tried to create their own lifeline to explore further, or perhaps a geologist who had forgotten to remove their markers. He decided to follow the blue ribbon and bring it back to the station. As he stepped off the manicured trail, the texture of the forest changed immediately. The ground became uneven, a labyrinth of twisted roots and jagged lava rocks covered in a deceptive layer of soft moss. He had to move slowly, carefully placing each foot to avoid a twisted ankle. The blue ribbon acted as a guide, leading him away from the sunlight and into the shadows. The further he went, the more the silence began to change. In the center of the forest, the silence is not just an absence of noise, it is a weight. Takahiro could hear the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears. He checked his compass, but the needle was vibrating in a slow, useless circle. He kept his eyes on the ribbon, which was now zigzagging around massive trunks. He noticed that the ribbon was not tied professionally. It was knotted hurriedly with long tails of plastic flapping in the stagnant air. Every 30 feet there was another knot. It was a trail of breadcrumbs, but it was not leading to a destination. It was leading into a vacuum. After 10 minutes of walking, Takahiro realized he could no longer see the main trail behind him. The trees here were hundreds of years old, their roots wrapping around the volcanic rock like gnarled fingers. The canopy was so thick that the sky was reduced to tiny flickering diamonds of light. Takahiro felt a slight chill. He had been in these woods for 15 years, but he had never followed a ribbon this far into this specific treacherous sector of the forest. Suddenly, the trees thinned out into a small natural clearing. Takahiro stopped in his tracks. He did not see a hiker or a researcher. Instead, he saw a scene that looked like it had been lifted from a suburban home and dropped into the wilderness. In the center of the mossy clearing, someone had arranged a heavy wooden desk, a matching chair, and a desk lamp. The furniture was slightly weathered by the elements, but it was perfectly placed, as if waiting for someone to sit down and begin a day's work. On top of the desk sat a collection of framed family photographs and a small portable shrine. There was no person in sight. The blue ribbon ended at the back of the chair, tied in a neat final bow that held no tension. Takahiro stood at the edge of the clearing, his heart beating against his ribs. He did not call out. In this forest, you do not call out unless you are prepared for the sound of your own voice to be the only thing that answers. He walked toward the desk and saw a leather-bound journal lying open. The pages were dry and perfectly preserved by the low-humidity microclimate. He did not touch the journal. He knew what this was. Over the years, he had seen many things left behind, but he had never seen a staged home like this. It was the clinical domestic precision of it that made the hair on his arms stand up. The person who had brought these things here had not just come to get lost. They had come to build a final room in the middle of nowhere. He pulled his radio from his belt and tried to call for a recovery team, but the iron in the ground made the signal break into a series of sharp metallic pops. He would have to hike back to the trail to get a clear signal. Before he left, he pulled his map from his pack and placed a small, precise X on the topographic lines, using a lead pencil to mark the exact location. That X was the first of many. When the 1997 annual sweep officially began a week later, more than 100 police officers, firefighters, and volunteers joined the forest rangers. They did not just walk the trails. They moved in a long shoulder-to-shoulder line through the restricted zones. They were looking for the plastic ribbons that Takahiro had found. They discovered that the sea of trees was filled with these markers. Some were white, some were yellow, and some were blue. They were lifelines for people who were not sure they wanted to go through with their decision, a way to find their way back to the road if they changed their mind. But for 73 individuals that year, the tape had only led one way. As the sweep progressed, the horror of the forest geography became clear. Because the lava bed was hollow, there were thousands of small caves and fissures hidden under the moss. Many of the searchers did not find the sites by looking ahead. They found them by stepping on a patch of moss that felt solid, only to have their leg plunge into a dark, hidden grave. Takahiro was leading one of the teams through a particularly dense sector when he felt the ground give way beneath his boots. He slid 3 feet down into a narrow fissure. When he looked up, he realized he was not in a cave. He was in a natural pocket of rock that had been missed by every sweep for the last decade. He was standing directly next to a site. In the dim light of the fissure, he saw the remnants of a life that had been forgotten. There were letters, a backpack, and a camera. The items were perfectly preserved, as if they had been placed there only yesterday. The silence in the hole was absolute. Takahiro realized that the forest was not just a park. It was a biological vault that grew over the people it claimed. At the end of the 1997 sweep, the authorities had recovered 73 people. It was one of the highest numbers in the forest's history. The data from Takahiro's map was used to identify hotspots where the most people were found. This led to a major shift in how the government managed the Aokigahara forest in the years that followed. They began installing security cameras at every entrance to monitor for people who arrived with no gear or appeared distressed. They placed large wooden signs at the trailheads with messages asking visitors to think of their families. They even listed a suicide prevention hotline. The 1997 sweep had forced the world to acknowledge what was happening in the trees. In the later years, the rangers were trained not just in forestry but in crisis intervention. They learned how to spot the wavering visitors, the ones who stood at the edge of the trail for hours looking at the trees. But for Takahiro, the forest would never be the same. Every time he saw a piece of plastic in the brush, he felt a cold, familiar weight in his chest. The 1997 findings solidified Aokigahara's place in global dark tourism. But for the people who live and work at the base of Mount Fuji, it is a place of deep, private tragedy. They know that the beauty of the sea of trees is only a thin layer of moss covering a history of isolation and the heavy silence of the volcanic rock that swallows every scream. To this day, the forest rangers still perform their annual sweeps. They still find the plastic ribbons, and they still find the X marks on the maps. Because in a place where the ground is hollow and the wind never blows, the secrets of the city do not just go away. They are simply buried under a vibrant electric green layer of moss and forgotten by the outside world. The wind does not move through the sea of trees, but the plastic ribbons still flutter against the bark like 1,000 tiny white flags. They are markers of where the normal world ends and the silence begins. And once you step past that line, the only thing you can hear is the sound of your own heart trying to find a rhythm in a place that has none. The search teams left the forest that spring, but the map remained at the station, a topographic record of 73 lives that vanished into the green. In the deep woods, the shadows are long and the air is still. And if you follow the tape far enough, you eventually realize that the forest was never meant to be a place where you find your way back home. In late March of 1997, in the upscale neighborhood of Rancho Santa Fe, California, a 33-year-old man named Rio D'Angelo was pulling his car up to the front of a sprawling white mansion. Rio was a web designer, the kind of person who felt most comfortable in front of a monitor writing code and organizing data. That morning, he was only finishing a short drive to visit his colleagues at their home and office to check on their progress. For the past few years, Rio had been part of a very unique group of people. They were a team of highly skilled computer programmers who ran a business called Higher Source. In the mid-1990s, when the internet was still a new and confusing frontier for most of the world, these people were the experts. They built professional websites for local businesses and organizations, and they were very good at it. They were disciplined, precise, and professional. But the group was much more than just a business. They lived together in this massive 9,000-square-foot mansion hidden behind a set of iron gates in one of the wealthiest parts of San Diego. Inside those walls, life followed a very strict and sterile rhythm. Everything was shared. They slept on bunk beds, they ate their meals at the same time, and they all wore the same style of simple, loose-fitting dark clothes. It was a life of total uniformity. The people Rio worked with were some of the most intelligent and focused individuals he had ever known. They valued logic above everything else. They did not have egos, they did not argue, and they did not care about the things most people in California cared about, like fame or money. They put all their earnings from their web design business back into the group. They were a family that had decided the outside world was too chaotic and they wanted something more. They were led by a man named Marshall Applewhite, whom they called Du. He was an older man with wide, intense eyes and a very soft way of speaking. He told them that they were not really human beings, but highly evolved souls who were just visiting Earth in these physical bodies, which he called earthly containers. Their goal was to prepare themselves to reach what he called the next level. They spent their nights on the mansion balcony studying the stars. In the spring of 1997, the atmosphere inside the mansion began to change. For months, the entire world had been watching the sky as a massive comet named Hale-Bopp began to approach Earth. It was one of the brightest comets in human history, visible to the naked eye, even in the middle of a city. To most people, it was a beautiful scientific event. But to the people inside the mansion, it was the signal they had been waiting for decades. Marshall Applewhite told the group that a spacecraft was traveling in the tail of the comet. He believed this ship was sent to pick them up and carry their souls to the next level. As the comet grew larger and brighter in the night sky every evening, the web design work at Higher Source began to slow down. The members became intensely focused on their preparations. They began to give away their belongings and settle their final business accounts in the city. Rio D'Angelo had recently decided to move out of the mansion to pursue his own path. but he remained on very good terms with the group. He still helped them with technical issues and checked in on them regularly. He noticed that his friends seemed happier than they had ever been. They were not scared or anxious about the comet. Instead, they were acting like a group of people who were about to go on a long-awaited vacation to a place they had only ever dreamed of. On the morning of March 25th, Rio was at his own apartment when a FedEx package arrived for him. Inside, he found a videotape and a set of keys to the mansion. He put the tape into his player and saw the faces of his friends appearing on the screen one by one. They were standing in the backyard of the mansion, smiling and waving at the camera. They were telling him goodbye, but they were doing it with genuine joy, as if they were excited for him to see what they did. Rio felt a sudden hollow weight in his stomach. He did not wait to finish the tape. He grabbed his car keys and drove straight to Rancho Santa Fe. The neighborhood was perfectly still. The sun was out, the palm trees were swaying in the breeze, and the neighbors were probably out playing golf or having lunch. To anyone passing by, the white mansion looked like any other luxury home. But when Rio reached the front gate, he saw that it had been left slightly ajar. He parked his car and walked up the long paved driveway. The house was silent. He reached the front door and found that it was unlocked. As he stepped into the foyer, he was hit by a very specific smell. It was not the smell of decay, but rather a faint medicinal scent mixed with the smell of heavy-duty cleaning supplies and something sweet like applesauce. The air conditioning was humming at a very low temperature, making the house feel like a cold storage unit. Rio called out the names of his friends, but there was no response. He walked into the first large bedroom off the main hallway. The room was painted a sterile white, and the curtains were drawn, blocking out the bright California sun. He saw several bunk beds lined up against the walls. On each bed, a figure was lying perfectly still on their back. They were all covered from head to toe in a square of royal purple silk that hid their faces and their bodies. He walked to the first bed and saw a pair of brand new black and white Nike sneakers poking out from under the purple shroud. The sneakers were perfectly clean, as if they had never touched the ground. Rio did not pull back the silk. He knew what he would find. He walked from room to room, finding the same scene over and over again. In every bedroom, on every bunk bed, there were people lying in their uniforms, waiting for the comet to take them home. The house was incredibly organized. There were no signs of a struggle and no signs of panic. In fact, the kitchen had been scrubbed clean. There were no dirty dishes in the sink. Rio noticed that the members had died in shifts. A small group would help the others ingest a mixture of phenobarbital and applesauce. Then they would tidy up the room, cover the bodies with the purple shrouds, and then it would be their turn to follow. It was a clinical digital process. As the police eventually arrived and began their investigation, they found that the group had packed small suitcases for their journey. The bags were placed neatly at the foot of each bed. Inside were changes of clothes, notebooks, and basic toiletries. They truly believed they were going somewhere. They had even gone so far as to have official patches made for their uniforms that read, "Heaven's Gate Away Team," a reference to their favorite science fiction shows. One detail in particular stood out to the investigators as they processed the scene. As they went through the pockets of the 39 people in the house, they found that every single one of them was carrying exactly $5.75. It consisted of a $5 bill and 3 quarters. When Rio heard this, he understood the logic. It was for intergalactic tolls. They wanted to make sure that even in the next life, they were prepared and had everything they needed. The news of the mass exit at Heaven's Gate shocked the country. People could not understand how 39 intelligent, successful adults could be convinced to leave their lives behind for a spacecraft trailing a comet. But for Rio, who knew them, the tragedy was in the precision. They had applied the same meticulous attention to detail they used for their web design business to their own end. They had turned a mansion into a launch pad for a flight that never came. The Nike Decade sneakers worn by the group became so infamous that the company eventually had to discontinue that specific model because it became a morbid collector's item. The mansion itself was eventually torn down, but the mystery of the group's digital legacy remains. The Heaven's Gate website, which they built themselves in the winter of 1996, is still live today. It is maintained by 2 surviving members who stayed behind to keep the gate open. If you visit the site now, you will see a frozen snapshot of the 1997 internet. The bright colors, the scrolling text, and the warnings about the comet are all still there. It serves as a digital monument to 39 people who were so focused on the next level that they forgot how to live in this one. They were pioneers who got lost in the data of their own faith, leaving behind a sterile white house and a set of shoes that never stepped off the earth. In June of 1998, on the steep, ice-covered slopes of Mount Rainier in Washington state, a small group of experienced climbers was making their way up the Liberty Ridge. The lead climber was 32 years old and was the kind of person who lived for the vertical world of high-altitude rock and ice. That afternoon, the group was in the middle of a routine training climb, enjoying a clear view of the city of Seattle shimmering in the sun thousands of feet below. To the lead climber, the mountain was a place where physics felt more honest than it did on the ground. He had spent most of his adult life learning the language of granite and frozen water. He was the kind of person who checked his knots 3 times, not because he was nervous, but because he respected the math of a fall. He spent his weekdays working a regular job just so he could spend his weekends hanging off a cliffside. He lived for the mechanical rhythm of axes hitting ice and the steady cold burn in his lungs as the air grew thinner. He valued his gear, not as possessions, but as lifelines. He knew exactly how much weight his carabiners could hold and how many seconds it took for a rope to snap under tension. To him, climbing was not about conquering a peak. It was about navigating a set of rules that the mountain laid out. This specific route, Liberty Ridge, was one of the most dangerous and vertical paths in North America. It required total focus and a deep trust in your partners. The group moved with a synchronized grace, alternating who took the lead and who secured the line. They were used to the physical toll of the ascent, finding a strange sense of peace in the isolation of the high-altitude terrain. Seattle looked like a toy city from up there. In the middle of the afternoon, the lead climber paused to catch his breath and looked up toward the summit. The sky was still a brilliant deep blue, but he noticed a small thin cloud starting to wrap around the very top of the mountain like a white silk scarf. In the climbing world, this is called a cloud cap. It looked harmless from a distance, but it was a sign that the mountain was beginning to generate its own localized weather system. Within 30 minutes, the temperature on the ridge began to drop. The transition was so fast it felt artificial. The sunlight did not fade slowly. It was swallowed by a sudden dense fog that rolled down from the summit. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, suddenly jumped to nearly 100 miles per hour. It was no longer just a storm. It was what climbers call a vertical blizzard, where the wind hits the mountain wall and shoots straight up. The force of the wind was so powerful it threatened to peel the climbers right off the rock face. Visibility dropped to less than 5 feet, turning their world into a blinding, swirling white vacuum. They could no longer see the city below or the route above. They were trapped on a vertical wall with nowhere to go. They had to find a place to stop, but the ridge offered no flat ground, only jagged rock and sheets of blue ice. They eventually found a small outcropping, a ledge that was barely the size of a pizza box. They huddled together, clipping their harnesses into the rock so the wind wouldn't carry them away. The lead climber tried to shout instructions, but the roar of the blizzard was so loud he couldn't even hear his own voice. The moisture in the air was freezing instantly upon contact with their jackets, creating a heavy layer of rime ice over everything. As the night wore on, the situation turned from a struggle into a crisis. One of the climbers began to lose the ability to move his hands. The ice was building up so quickly on his suit that he was literally becoming encased in a translucent shell. He was becoming a human ice statue, frozen in a sitting position against the granite. The lead climber knew that if they stayed on this ledge until morning, none of them would be coming down. They managed to trigger a distress signal on their radio, a faint pulse that eventually reached the 214th Medical Company. At the base of the mountain, the rescue teams were looking at the weather data in disbelief. While the valley below was enjoying a mild summer evening, the ridge was experiencing hurricane-force winds and sub-zero temperatures. It was a micro-Arctic zone that shouldn't have existed. A warrant officer named Bill Sahlberg was the pilot of a massive CH-47 Chinook helicopter. He was told that a standard rescue was impossible because of the wind and the vertical angle of the cliff. But Sahlberg was the kind of pilot who saw physics as a challenge rather than a limit. He knew that the only way to get to the ledge was to perform a maneuver that most pilots only saw in training manuals. The Chinook roared toward the mountain, its twin rotors fighting against the turbulent air. As they approached Liberty Ridge, the climbers on the ledge heard a sound that seemed to vibrate through the rock itself. It was the deep, rhythmic thrum of the helicopter engines. Through the whiteout, they saw the faint glow of the landing lights. The helicopter was hovering just inches away from the vertical wall, its blades churning up a second blizzard of snow. Bill Sahlberg moved the multi-ton machine with the precision of a surgeon. He tilted the helicopter forward until one of the rear landing skids made contact with the narrow ridge. This is known as a pinnacle landing. He had to hold the helicopter in a partial hover, keeping the front rotors clear of the rock while the back of the aircraft rested on a ledge that was never meant to support a vehicle. It was a feat of absolute aerial balance. The back ramp of the Chinook lowered, and a climbing ranger stepped out into the chaos. The wind from the rotors was so strong it almost knocked him over. He saw the climbers huddled on the ledge, looking like ghosts covered in white frost. He reached for the climber, who was encased in ice, and realized he couldn't move him. The man was literally frozen to the mountain. The ranger had to use his ice axe to chip away the frozen shell. One by one, the survivors were pulled from the ledge and into the warmth of the helicopter. The lead climber was the last to leave. He looked back at the pizza box ledge, where they had spent the night, seeing the jagged ice and the dark granite vanishing back into the whiteout. As soon as the last boot cleared the ramp, Solberg pulled the Chinook away from the cliff and dived into the valley away from the mountain's reach. The rescue at Liberty Ridge remains one of the most daring missions in the history of the National Park Service and the United States Air Force. It proved that Mount Rainier was not just a mountain, but an isolated giant that could create its own rules and its own weather. The lead climber survived, but he never looked at a cloud cap the same way again. He knew that the line between a routine climb and a vertical grave was thinner than a sheet of ice. The sound of the Chinook's engine echoed off the granite wall, a roar that was eventually swallowed by the silence of the ice. The mountain remained behind, hidden in its own private blizzard, waiting for the next person to test the math of the ridge. Frederick Bourdin looked into the camera and smiled, knowing he had been a better son than the one who actually belonged there. But before we see the face of the imposter, we have to understand the family that was desperate enough to believe a lie. In October of 1997, in a quiet residential neighborhood in San Antonio, Texas, a woman named Carrie Gibson was sitting in her kitchen, going through the motions of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Carrie was in her mid-30s and was the kind of person who held a family together through sheer willpower and a refusal to give up. That day, she was just checking the mail and thinking about what to make for dinner, unaware that the telephone was about to ring with a message that would defy every law of logic and biology. For the past 3 years, Carrie's life had been defined by a hole that nothing could fill. In June of 1994, her younger brother Nicholas Barclay had vanished. Nicholas was 13 years old at the time, a kid with blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a bit of a rebellious streak. He had gone to a park to play basketball with friends, and he simply never came home. There were no witnesses, no struggle, and no clues. One minute he was a boy with a whole life ahead of him, and the next he was a face on a missing person poster. The Barclay household had become a place of suspended animation. Carrie and her mother Beverly lived in a house where time had stopped on the day Nicholas disappeared. They kept his bedroom exactly as he had left it, with his clothes still in the drawers and his posters still on the walls. They were a typical Texas family that had been hollowed out by an unexplained tragedy. Carrie was the rock. She was the one who kept the files, who stayed in contact with the police, and who refused to let the world forget her brother's name. They were used to the silence of a house that was missing a person. They were used to the false leads and the prank calls that usually follow a high-profile disappearance. But mostly they were used to the feeling of waiting for a miracle that deep down they knew might never happen. Carrie valued the memory of her brother more than anything else, and she had spent every day of those 3 years looking for his face in every crowd. She was a woman who lived on hope because the alternative was too dark to consider. Then the phone rang. It was a call from a youth shelter in Linares, Spain. The person on the other end told Carrie that they had found a teenage boy who claimed to be Nicholas Barclay. He told a terrifying story of being kidnapped by a child trafficking ring, taken across the ocean and held captive for years before finally escaping. He was scared, he was traumatized, and he wanted to come home. To Carrie and her mother, it was the miracle they had prayed for every single night since 1994. Carrie did not hesitate. She gathered her savings, packed a bag, and flew halfway across the world to Spain. She arrived at the shelter with a heart full of adrenaline and desperation. When she was led into the room to meet the boy, she saw someone who looked very different from the 13-year-old who had walked away 3 years earlier. This boy looked older. He had dark hair instead of blonde, and his face seemed thinner and more guarded. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, and he spoke with a thick, strange accent. But when he saw Carrie, he started to cry. He called her by name and reached out for her. In that moment, the biological details didn't seem to matter as much as the emotional connection. Carrie saw a boy who was broken and needed his family. She saw the miracle she had been looking for. The shelter staff were a bit skeptical because the physical differences were so glaring, but Carrie was adamant. She told them that this was her brother, that his trauma had changed him, and that she was taking him back to San Antonio. The boy explained that his captors had performed medical experiments on him, which was why his hair had turned dark and his eyes were no longer the bright blue they used to be. He He said they had injected chemicals into his eyes to change their color so he couldn't be identified. It was a wild, improbable story, but Carrie accepted it without question. She wanted her brother back so badly that she was willing to rewrite the laws of nature to make it true. She brought him through customs and flew him home to Texas. When they landed in San Antonio, the boy was greeted as a hero. The local news crews were there to film the reunion, and the community celebrated the return of the missing Barkley boy. He moved back into his old bedroom, the one Carrie had kept ready for 3 years. He started wearing Nicholas's old clothes and hanging out with Nicholas's old friends. For nearly 4 months, this boy lived as Nicholas Barkley. He sat at the dinner table, he watched television with the family, and he played the role of a son and a brother. But there was a private investigator named Charlie Parker who couldn't let the eye color go. Charlie was a man who trusted evidence over emotion. He started looking at the photos Carrie had taken in Spain and compared them to the old photos of Nicholas from 1994. He noticed that the boy in the house had brown eyes, and no matter what kind of chemical you inject into a person, you cannot change the underlying structure of the iris. He also noticed that the boy had a very distinct shape to his ears. Charlie Parker knew that while a face can change with age or trauma, the internal structure of a human ear is as unique as a fingerprint. It does not change. He reached out to a contact in the FBI, and they began a quiet investigation. They realized that the boy living in the Barkley house was not a 16-year-old from Texas. He was actually a 23-year-old French national named Frédéric Bourdin. He was a professional con artist known to European police as the Chameleon because of his ability to steal identities. When the truth finally came out, the world was horrified. Bourdin was arrested and eventually admitted to the entire scheme. He told the authorities that he had just been looking for a place to belong and that the Barkley family had been the perfect target. He had studied Nicholas's case files while at the shelter and used the information to trick Carrie. But as the investigation deepened, a new and darker question began to emerge. It was a question that would haunt the case for the next 30 years. Investigators wondered how a family could be so easily fooled. Carrie had spent years with her brother. She knew every inch of his face. The mother Beverly had raised him. How could they not see that the man sitting at their table was 7 years older, had the wrong eyes, the wrong ears, and a French accent? The FB. I began to look into the possibility that the family knew he was an imposter from the very first day. They wondered if the family was using the imposter to cover up the truth about what happened to the real Nicholas. There were rumors and theories that Nicholas had not been kidnapped at all, but that something had happened to him at home in 1994. The theory was that if the family accepted a stranger as Nicholas, then nobody would ever look for the body of the real boy again. It would be the perfect way to close a cold case. But the Barkleys denied this, insisting they were just victims of a brilliant liar. Frédéric Bourdin, for his part, began to drop hints that he had discovered dark secrets while living in that house. He claimed that the family's reaction to him was not one of love, but of relief. He said they didn't ask too many questions because they were glad the investigation was over. Bourdin was eventually deported back to Europe, where he continued his life of deception, claiming to have stolen hundreds of different identities over the years. He became a legend in the world of criminal psychology, a man who could look into a mother's eyes and convince her he was her son, even when the biological truth was staring her in the face. The real Nicholas Barkley remains a missing person to this day. His case is still open, but the trail has been cold for decades. The Barkley house in San Antonio is no longer the place of a miracle, but a place of deep, unresolved shadows. Carrie and her family eventually moved on, but they are forever linked to one of the most bizarre cases of identity theft in history. It remains a story about the power of belief and the terrifying things people are willing to ignore when they are desperate for a happy ending. Frédéric Bourdin looked into the camera and smiled, knowing he had been a better son than the one who actually belonged there. He had walked into a grave and made himself at home, and for a few months, everyone was happy to let him stay. He remains a reminder that sometimes the person sitting across from you is exactly who you want them to be rather than who they actually are. In the end, the eyes didn't lie, but the heart did, and that was all the imposter needed to win. A small white dog ran home alone, her leash dragging through the autumn leaves, like a final broken connection. But before the dog returned, we have to look at the high hedges of a narrow lane in Exeter, where a 14-year-old girl was just trying to do a favor for her neighbor. On a Saturday afternoon in mid-November of 1997, in the historic city of Exeter, England, a 40-year-old father named Jerry Bushell was sitting in his living room on Burrator Drive. Jerry was the kind of man who found deep comfort in the predictable rhythm of a quiet weekend. That afternoon, he was just relaxing and watching the sky turn gray, waiting for his 14-year-old daughter to return from a quick neighborhood errand. Exeter was the kind of place where parents didn't spend their days looking over their shoulders. It was a cathedral city in Devon, filled with cobblestone streets, ancient stone walls, and a sense of permanent safety that had lasted for generations. In the late 1990s, the idea of a violent stranger lurking in the nearby country lanes felt like something that only happened in movies or in much larger, more chaotic cities. Jerry's daughter, Kate, was the heart of their home. She was 14 years old, bright, and incredibly popular at St. Thomas High School. She was the kind of teenager who actually enjoyed helping people. If a neighbor needed their lawn mowed or their mail picked up, Kate was usually the first person to volunteer. She had a maturity that went beyond her years, and Jerry often found himself marveling at how steady and reliable she had become. On that particular Saturday, the air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. It was a typical autumn day in the West Country. Kate had agreed to help a neighbor by taking their dog for a walk. The dog was a small, energetic Jack Russell Terrier named Gemma. It was a simple task that Kate had done many times before, a short loop that usually took about 45 minutes to an hour at most. Kate left the house around 4:30 in the afternoon. She was wearing a casual jacket and sneakers, her hair pulled back, looking like any other teenager heading out for some fresh air. She waved to Jerry as she headed down the driveway with Gemma on a lead. Jerry watched her walk toward Exwick Lane, a narrow, high-hedged road that led away from the suburban houses and into the rolling green hills that surrounded the city. Exwick Lane was a place that Jerry and his family knew well. It was a favorite spot for local dog walkers and joggers. The lane was essentially a boreen, a road so narrow that cars had to pull into grass verges to let each other pass. It was flanked by massive ancient hedgerows that grew 6 or 7 feet tall, creating a sort of natural tunnel that felt isolated and private, even though it was only a few hundred yards from the nearest housing estate. Jerry spent the next hour doing small chores around the house. He valued the quiet stability of his life in Exeter. He had a good job, a loving family, and a daughter he could truly be proud of. He was thinking about the upcoming Christmas holidays and the things they needed to get done. To him, the world was a logical place where hard work and kindness were rewarded with peace and safety. He had no reason to believe otherwise. By 5:30, the sun had dropped below the horizon, and the twilight was beginning to fade into true darkness. Jerry looked at the clock on the wall and realized that Kate should have been home by now. He wasn't worried yet, just curious. He figured she might have stopped to talk to a friend, or perhaps Gemma had been particularly stubborn on the walk. He went to the kitchen to start thinking about dinner, expecting to hear the front door open at any second. About 15 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't Kate, it was the neighbor who owned Gemma. The neighbor looked confused and a little concerned. They told Jerry that Gemma had just been seen running loose near the entrance to Exwick Lane. The dog was alone, and her lead was still attached to her collar, trailing behind her in the mud. There was no sign of Kate anywhere in the street. The moment Jerry heard about the trailing lead, a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline hit his chest. A dog like Gemma wouldn't just be let go, and Kate was far too responsible to lose control of a pet. Jerry didn't say a word. He grabbed his coat and a flashlight and ran out into the damp evening air. He headed straight for the lane, his mind racing through every possible scenario, though none of them made any sense. He reached the mouth of Exwick Lane and began to walk quickly into the darkness. The high hedges made the space feel even tighter than usual, and the beam of his flashlight cut through the mist in thin, shivering lines. He called out Kate's name, his voice echoing off the stone walls and the thick vegetation. The only sound that came back was the rustle of dry leaves and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. Jerry walked further and further, his pace increasing until he was almost running. He knew every turn of this path. About 300 yards from his front door, there was a wooden stile that led into a large open field. It was a common place for people to let their dogs off the lead to run. As Jerry approached the stile, he noticed something in the grass just beyond the wooden steps. His flashlight caught a flash of color that didn't belong in the gray winter landscape. He climbed over the stile and stepped into the field. His breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. He moved the light across the ground and found Kate. She was lying in the grass, and it was immediately clear that she had been the victim of a savage and catastrophic attack. Jerry's world, the logical and safe world he had built in Exeter, collapsed in a single heartbeat. He fell to his knees in the mud, screaming for help into the empty, silent field. The police arrived within minutes, cordoning off the lane and the field. They were stunned by the violence of the crime. In a city like Exeter, a homicide was rare. A predatory attack on a 14-year-old schoolgirl was almost unheard of. The lead investigator looking at the scene realized they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a local dispute. This was a blitz attack, one that was carried out with terrifying speed and premeditation. As the forensic teams began their painstaking work under portable floodlights, they discovered a detail that would define the case for the next 3 decades. Scattered across Kate's clothes and her body were more than 100 bright, unnatural fibers. They were a vivid shade of orange. These weren't just random lint. They were high-quality polyester and cotton fibers that had been dyed with a very specific azoic chemical process. The investigation determined that these fibers likely came from heavy-duty industrial workwear, the kind of boiler suits or aprons used in specific trades like masonry, carpentry, or factory labor. The killer had been wearing something so bright it would have stood out in any crowd, yet nobody remembered seeing a man in bright orange near the lane that day. The fibers suggested a predator who had come prepared, someone who moved in the shadows despite his clothing. Detectives began a massive search for witnesses. They eventually found several people who remembered seeing a small blue car, possibly a Ford Fiesta or a Vauxhall Nova, parked in a nearby lay-by about 20 minutes before Kate was found. A witness also reported seeing a man with dark hair standing near the stile looking toward the houses. But like the blue car, the man seemed to vanish into the Devon countryside the moment the sun went down. The horror of the Kate Bushell murder changed the city of Exeter forever. For years afterward, parents refused to let their children walk to school alone. The high hedges of the country lanes, once seen as charming and private, were now viewed as walls that hid monsters. The community was haunted by the fact that the killer had likely sat in that lane, watching the families in the houses just 300 yards away, waiting for the right moment to strike. Despite 28 years of appeals, thousands of DNA samples, and a major forensic re-review in 2022, the identity of the man in the orange workwear remains a mystery. The case is often linked to other unsolved murders in the West Country, leading to theories of a serial predator who used the narrow, high-hedged lanes of the region as his hunting grounds. To this day, the files remain open, but the killer is a ghost. Jerry Bushell never truly left that field. He spent the rest of his life advocating for justice for his daughter, holding on to the memory of the bright, helpful girl who had walked out the door with a neighbor's dog and never came back. He became a symbol of the quiet, enduring grief of a father who did everything right, only to find that the world was not nearly as safe or as logical as he had once believed. The investigation continues to focus on the orange fibers. Modern technology has allowed police to trace the specific batch of dye used in the fabric, narrowing it down to a handful of manufacturers. They believe that somewhere in an old garage or a forgotten locker, there is a piece of orange clothing that holds the key to the entire mystery. But until that piece is found, the case of Kate Bushell will remain Exeter's darkest and most painful secret. A small white dog ran home alone, her leash dragging through the autumn leaves like a final broken connection. The neighbor found her shivering at the gate, but the girl who had been holding the other end of that leash was gone, leaving behind only a few strands of bright orange thread and a father who would never stop looking for the truth in the shadows of Exwick Lane. The smell of dish soap mixed with the heavy scent of cave mud, a lingering reminder of the 20 hours the earth tried to swallow a man whole. But before we reach the bottom of the cave, we have to understand the vertical geometry of a hole that was never meant for a human body. In the spring of 1998, in the rural wooded hills of Schoharie County, New York, a 20-year-old man named Craig Douglas was standing at the edge of a small, inconspicuous hole in the earth. It was a cool morning, and the air smelled of damp pine needles and the sharp metallic scent of wet limestone. Craig was checking his headlamp and tightening the laces on his muddy hiking boots, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this dozens of times before. He was the kind of person who didn't need a crowd to have a good time. He was an adventurer, a thrill seeker, and someone who felt most at ease when he was navigating the narrow, hidden spaces that most people would never even know existed. That morning, he was in the middle of a completely ordinary Saturday excursion, looking forward to spending a few hours underground in a place known to local explorers as the Keyhole Cave. Craig was not a professional caver, at least not by title, but he had spent enough time in the dark to know the rules of the world beneath the surface. He was a steady young man with a lean, athletic build that made him perfect for the physical demands of caving. He was the kind of person who trusted his own strength and his own instincts. He didn't rush into things blindly, but he also didn't let fear dictate his movements. He valued the silence of the earth and the absolute focus required to move through a tight passage. For Craig, caving was a form of meditation. When you are deep underground, the rest of the world ceases to exist. There are no phones, no deadlines, and no distractions. There is only the rock, the light from your helmet, and the sound of your own breathing. He liked the fact that the cave didn't care who he was or what he did for a living. It was an ancient, indifferent place that required total respect. Most of Craig's life was spent seeking out these kinds of challenges. He wasn't reckless, but he had a high tolerance for discomfort. He enjoyed the mechanical puzzle of finding a way through a rock formation that seemed impassable. He had a deep appreciation for the geology of New York, specifically the way the water had carved out these limestone labyrinths over thousands of years. On this particular Saturday, he had invited a couple of friends along to explore a section of the Keyhole Cave they hadn't seen yet. They were a tight-knit group used to watching each other's backs and moving in a synchronized rhythm through the mud and the dark. The entrance to the cave was small, just a narrow slot in the hillside, and as they crawled in, the temperature dropped to a constant damp 50 degrees. They moved slowly, their lights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the glistening walls and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. For the first hour, the trip was exactly what they had hoped for. They navigated through several wide chambers and a few moderate crawls, laughing and calling out to each other as they found interesting rock formations. Craig was in his element, leading the way and checking the stability of the path ahead. He felt a sense of peace in the mechanical routine of the climb. He liked the smell of the cave mud and the way the limestone felt cold and slightly grit like against his palms. They eventually reached a section of the cave that narrowed into a vertical fissure. This was the legendary keyhole that gave the cave its name. It was a long, thin slot in the rock that required a person to turn their body just right to pass through. It looked like a playground for someone with Craig's build, a simple technical challenge that would lead them into a deeper, less explored part of the cavern. Craig approached the fissure first. He looked down into the gap and saw that it was a vertical drop of about 10 feet, ending in a very narrow wedge. To get through, he would need to slide down feet first, keeping his arms above his head. He had done similar moves before and he didn't hesitate. He began to lower himself into the slot, his boots searching for purchase on the wet limestone. The space was tight, pressing against his chest and his back, but he kept moving, inching his way down. He was about halfway through the passage when his left boot hit a patch of slick, wet cave mud that had been hidden in a crevice. In a split second, his footing vanished. Instead of a controlled descent, Craig began to slide. Because of the vertical angle, he didn't slide feet first. He tilted forward, his center of gravity shifting in the cramped space, and he slipped head first into the narrowest part of the wedge. The slide lasted less than a second, but when it stopped, the world changed. Craig was now hanging completely upside down in a space that was barely wide enough for a human chest. His hips were wedged into the tightest point of the V-shaped rock, and his head was pointed toward the bottom of the fissure. His arms were pinned against his sides, and his legs were sticking up into the air useless. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the cave. Craig's brain tried to process the geometry of what had just happened. He was in a vertical trap, and gravity was now his primary enemy. He tried to wiggle his hips to push himself back up, but the rock was smooth and lubricated by the very mud that had caused him to fall. Every time he moved, he didn't go up. He felt himself settle a fraction of an inch deeper into the wedge, the limestone pressing harder against his ribs. His friends who were still above him called out his name, their voices sounding muffled and distant through the narrow opening. Craig tried to answer, but he found that he couldn't take a full breath. When a person is upside down, the internal organs begin to press against the diaphragm, making it difficult for the lungs to expand. But there was a more terrifying physical reality at play in the keyhole. Because the fissure was V-shaped every time Craig exhaled, his chest cavity would shrink slightly. In that brief moment when his lungs were empty, gravity would pull him just a little bit deeper into the narrow point of the wedge. Then when he tried to take his next breath, the rock was already there, preventing his chest from expanding back to its original size. He was trapped in a biological death clock. Every breath out was making the hole smaller, and every breath in was becoming a struggle for survival. The panic started as a low, cold hum in the back of his mind. Craig knew enough about physiology to understand that being upside down for a long period is a death sentence. The blood begins to pool in the brain, and the lungs start to fill with fluid, a condition called pulmonary edema. He had to get out, and he had to get out fast. He told his friends what was happening, his voice strained and high-pitched. They tried to reach down and grab his ankles, but the opening was so narrow that only one person could get close at a time, and they couldn't get enough leverage to pull his dead weight upward against the friction of the rock. They realized very quickly that they were out of their depth. One of them stayed behind to keep talking to Craig, while the other raced out of the cave and up the hillside to find a phone. They needed the National Cave Rescue Commission. For the next few hours, Craig Douglas existed in a world that was reduced to the size of his own body. He was in total darkness, save for the faint glow of his friend's light above him. He could feel the cold dampness of the limestone through his clothes, and the smell of the cave mud was overwhelming. He tried to stay calm, focusing on slow, shallow breaths to keep from sliding further, but the physical toll of being upside down was starting to set in. He felt a throbbing pressure in his temples, and his vision began to blur. He talked to his friend about anything they could think of, trying to keep his mind from spiraling into the realization that he was being eaten by the earth. He talked about his family, about his plans for the summer, and about the things he wanted to do when he got out. But every few minutes, he would slip another millimeter, and the rock would tighten its grip. The rescue teams arrived late in the afternoon. They were some of the best technical cavers in the country, men and women who were used to working in high-pressure environments. But when they reached the keyhole, they were stunned by the difficulty of the situation. The geometry was a nightmare. They couldn't use heavy machinery or even large hand tools because there was simply no room to move. They had to form a human chain with the person at the very front, lying flat against the rock, reaching down into the hole to grab Craig's boots. The rescuers were working in shifts, their own chests pressed against the cold limestone, breathing in the same stale, humid air. They tried several times to pull him out using sheer force, but Craig would scream in pain as the rock tore at his skin. The friction was too great, and the angle of the wedge was working like a one-way valve. As the sun went down above the surface, the situation inside the cave became desperate. Craig had been upside down for over 10 hours. He was starting to drift in and out of consciousness, his speech becoming slurred and nonsensical. The rescuers knew they were running out of time. If they didn't free him soon, his heart would simply give out. They decided to try a different approach. They sent someone back to the surface to gather every bottle of lubricant they could find. They returned with gallons of vegetable oil and dish soap. They began to pour the liquid down the sides of the fissure, hoping to turn the limestone into a slide. The smell of lemons and grease began to fill the narrow chamber, a bizarre and unnatural scent in the middle of a prehistoric cave. They waited for the oil to seep down between Craig's body and the rock, praying that it would be enough to break the seal. The 20-hour mark passed. Craig was now almost completely unresponsive. The rescue team at the front of the chain was exhausted, their muscles cramping from the cold and the awkward positions they had to hold. They decided to try one final synchronized pull. They rigged a series of haul lines to Craig's ankles, distributing the weight among 4 different rescuers. On a count of 3, they all leaned back with everything they had. For a second, nothing happened. The rock seemed to hold on with a stubborn, ancient strength. But then there was a sound that everyone in the chamber would remember for the rest of their lives. It was a loud, wet pop like a cork being pulled from a bottle. The sound of Craig's body sliding against the lubricated limestone echoed through the fissure. He moved an inch, then 6 inches, and then finally his hips cleared the narrowest part of the wedge. The human chain moved back quickly, pulling Craig up through the keyhole and onto a wider ledge. He was covered in a mixture of cave mud, vegetable oil, and blood, and he was completely limp. The medics immediately began working on him, elevating his head and starting an IV to stabilize his blood pressure. They carried him out of the cave on a specialized stretcher, a grueling process that took another 2 hours of careful maneuvering through the narrow tunnels. When they finally emerged into the cool night air of Schoharie County, the stars were out and a crowd of local residents and reporters had gathered near the entrance. Craig was loaded into an ambulance and rushed to the nearest trauma center, where he would spend weeks recovering from the physical and psychological toll of the entrapment. He had survived a hole that was never meant for a human being. The rescue of Craig Douglas is still studied by the National Cave Rescue Commission as a masterclass in technical geometry and the use of unconventional tools. It remains a legendary story in the caving community, a reminder of how quickly a routine thrill can turn into a battle for every breath. Craig eventually recovered, but he never returned to the Keyhole Cave. He had learned exactly what the earth was capable of when it decided to tighten its grip. The cave is still there, tucked away in the New York hillside, and the narrow fissure still sits in the dark waiting. The limestone is still wet, and the mud is still slick, and the silence is just as heavy as it was in 1998. It is a place that doesn't care about your plans or your strength. It only cares about the math of the wedge and the steady, inevitable pull of gravity. The smell of dish soap mixed with the heavy scent of cave mud, a lingering reminder of the 20 hours the earth tried to swallow him whole. The rescuers left the cave that night, leaving the oil and the soap to slowly wash away in the dampness, but the image of those boots sticking out of the rock stayed with them forever. In the dark, the keyhole remains a one-way door for anyone who forgets to respect the exhale. On a humid evening in January of 1998, at the Woodlands MRT station in Singapore, a 19-year-old student named Dini Haryati was stepping off a train. Dini was the kind of person who moved with a quiet, practiced confidence that came from years of physical discipline. That evening, she was finishing a long shift as a hotel intern and starting the final 5 minutes of her commute to her family's apartment. Dini was originally from Indonesia, but she had spent the last few months in Singapore, completing an internship at the Albert Court Hotel. She was only 1 week away from finishing her placement and returning home to Jakarta to be with her family. To her father, Ustam Danata Dini was the absolute pride of the family. She wasn't just a dedicated student, she was a double black belt in both karate and taekwondo. She was a 19-year-old who knew exactly how to defend herself in a crisis. In any kind of physical confrontation, Dini was an elite athlete with the training and the reflexes to neutralize an opponent in a matter of seconds. Because of this, and because Singapore was famously one of the safest cities on the entire planet, her father never spent his nights worrying about her. He saw her as someone who could handle anything. Singapore in the late 1990s was a place of high-tech efficiency and very low levels of public anxiety. Street crime was almost non-existent, and the city's reputation for safety was a point of national pride. Thousands of young women used the mass rapid transit system every night, walking home through well-lit neighborhoods and lush public parks without a second thought. The idea of a predator was a foreign concept. Dini's father, Ustam, was a successful banker who valued order, security, and the bright future he saw for his daughter. He loved that she was gaining professional experience in such a stable environment. He spent his days in Jakarta checking his watch, knowing exactly when Dini's shift ended and when she would be walking through the front door of their Singapore flat. Their lives were built on the reliability of these schedules. Dini was known for her punctuality. At the Albert Court Hotel, she was the intern who was always 5 minutes early and the last one to leave if a guest needed help. She was a week away from her 19th birthday, and she was already talking about her plans to start a full-time career in hospitality. She valued the discipline she learned in martial arts, and she applied that same focus to every aspect of her life, from her studies to her work. The relationship between Dini and her father was one of deep mutual respect. They spoke almost every day, and Ustam often told his colleagues that Dini was the strongest person he knew. He didn't just mean her physical strength, but her character. She was a young woman who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to work hard for her dreams. In the safety of Singapore, that strength seemed like it would be enough to carry her through any challenge. The Woodlands district where Dini lived was a modern residential area characterized by high-rise apartment blocks and carefully maintained green spaces. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other and children played in the corridors. For Dini, the walk from the train station to her apartment was a transition period, a time to decompress after a long day at the hotel and think about her upcoming trip back to Jakarta. On the night of January 4th, 1998, the schedule finally broke. Dini finished her shift at the hotel at 11 p.m. and boarded a train heading toward the northern part of the island. This was a routine she had performed dozens of times without incident. CCTV cameras at the Woodland station captured her walking through the turnstiles at exactly 11:38 p.m. She looked tired but calm as she adjusted her bag. She walked out of the station and into the humid tropical night. The walk from the station to her apartment block was roughly 300 yards, a distance she could usually cover in exactly 5 minutes. The path was a paved walkway that passed by a small patch of secondary forest, a dense tropical buffer zone that separated the transport hub from the residential buildings. It was a mundane, ordinary stretch of concrete used by thousands of commuters. As Dini started her walk, the station was still busy with people coming home from late shifts. The air was heavy, with the smell of damp soil and tropical rain. She turned onto the paved path that skirted the edge of the forest patch. To her right were the bright lights of the station, and to her left was a thick wall of trees and bushes. It was a route so familiar she probably could have walked it with her eyes closed. When Dini did not arrive home by midnight, the family members staying in the Singapore flat began to feel a strange, cold sense of unease. At first they thought the train might have been delayed, or perhaps she had stopped to get a quick snack at one of the late-night stalls. But as the minutes ticked toward 1 a.m., the unease turned into a sharp, frantic panic. They called her hotel, they called her friends, and then they called the police. A search began immediately, with officers retracing every step of the 5-minute route. They checked the station cameras again and confirmed that Dini had exited the building at 11:38 p.m. Then they checked the security cameras at the entrance to her apartment complex. She was never seen entering the lobby. Somewhere in that 300-yard gap in a window of less than 5 minutes, Dini Hariati had simply been erased from the world. The logic of the situation was impossible to reconcile. A 19-year-old double black belt does not just vanish in the middle of a secure, well-lit city. There were no reports of screams, no signs of a struggle on the path, and no witnesses who saw anything unusual. It was as if she had stepped off the train and walked directly into a vacuum. The police launched a massive operation, scouring the Woodlands area for any trace of the missing girl. For 2 days, the district was swarmed by officers and volunteers. They moved through the shopping centers and the corridors of the high-rise buildings, showing Dini's photo to everyone they met. Ustam Dinata flew in from Jakarta, his world collapsing into a frantic search for his daughter. He walked that 300-yard path over and over again, looking at every bush and every shadow, unable to comprehend how she could be gone so close to home. Ustam stood near the forest patch, calling his daughter's name until his voice was hoarse. He looked at the paved path, then at the thick vegetation, and back to the station lights. He knew his daughter was a fighter. He knew she wouldn't have gone quietly. He kept telling the investigators that she was a black belt, that she could defend herself. But as the hours turned into days, the hope that she was simply lost began to fade. On the morning of January 6th, a gardener was working in the thick patch of secondary forest near the station. He was clearing away debris after a heavy rain when he noticed something white sticking out from under a pile of damp, rotting tropical leaves. He moved closer, thinking it was just discarded trash from a commuter, but as he cleared the debris, he found the body of Dini Hariati. She was lying only a few yards away from the paved path. The discovery was a shock to the entire nation. Dini had been raped, bludgeoned, and strangled. The forensic investigation revealed a level of violence that was jarring for a city like Singapore. Dini had been hit with a heavy object with such force that it likely incapacitated her instantly. This was the only way to explain how a double black belt could be overpowered without a prolonged struggle or a scream that someone would have heard. The predator had used a blitz attack, striking from the deep shadows of the buffer forest just as Dini walked past. The attack was so fast and so violent that her training never had a chance to kick in. She had been dragged into the thick brush within seconds, hidden from view by the very trees that the residents used as a natural sound barrier. The murderer had chosen a spot where the vegetation was the densest and the escape routes were the clearest. The Singapore police force launched one of the most intensive investigations in its history. They collected DNA samples from hundreds of men in the Woodlands area and interviewed every single person who had been at the station on the night of January 4th. They featured the case on the television show Crime Watch, meticulously recreating Dini's final walk and appealing to the public for any small detail that might lead to a suspect. Despite the high-tech forensic capabilities of the Singapore police and the massive public appeal, the trail went completely cold. There were no eyewitnesses, no usable fingerprints, and the DNA found at the scene did not match anyone in the national database. The killer had vanished into the crowds of the city just as quickly as Dini had been taken from the path. It was a crime that seemed to defy the near-perfect security of the island. Investigators eventually realized that the killer had likely used the city's own environment to his advantage. The rhythmic mechanical hum of the arriving and departing MRT trains provided a constant background noise at the Woodlands station. If Dini had managed to let out a single cry for help, it would have been easily drowned out by the sound of the next train pulling into the station or the hum of the air conditioning units in the nearby buildings. The predator hadn't just used the shadows, he had used the city's own heartbeat to mask his crime. He had timed his attack with the schedule of the trains, knowing that the noise would cover any sound of a struggle. For Ustam Dinata, the safety of Singapore became a bitter, tragic irony. He had sent his daughter to one of the most secure places on Earth, only for her to be taken in the final 500 seconds of her journey home. The fact that Dini was a double black belt served as a haunting reminder for the entire community. It showed that even the strongest and most disciplined people can be vulnerable when a predator is allowed to choose the time, the place, and the method of a confrontation. The sense of absolute safety that the residents of Woodlands had felt for years was shattered. People began to look at the small patches of forest not as parks but as hiding places. Dini Hariati was a week away from going home to Jakarta to start the next chapter of her life. She was a 19-year-old who knew how to fight, but she never got the chance to use her training. Her case remains open today, a 28-year void in a city that prides itself on knowing everything about everyone. The paved path is still there, and the trains still hum every few minutes, carrying thousands of people past the spot where she was found. The tropical rain still washes the damp soil of the buffer forest, and the air is still heavy with the scent of wet earth. The walk from the station to the apartments remains exactly 300 yards. But for those who remember 1998, that short distance feels much longer than it used to. The shadows near the Woodlands station are a little bit deeper for anyone who knows the story of the girl who never made it through the lobby doors. Ustam Dinata returned to Jakarta without his daughter, carrying only her belongings and the memory of the strong, disciplined girl he had raised. He never got the answers he was looking for, and the man who stepped out of the shadows that night has never been named. The case of Dini Haryadi remains one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries in Southeast Asia, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous place is the one that feels the safest. On the evening of November 14th, 1997, in the quiet residential suburb of Saanich, British Columbia, a 14-year-old girl named Reena Virk was in her bedroom getting ready to go out. Reena was in the middle of a completely ordinary Friday night routine, standing in front of her mirror and carefully applying a layer of dark eyeliner. She was the kind of person who spent a lot of time thinking about how she appeared to the rest of the world, constantly adjusting her clothes and her hair until they felt just right. That evening, she was only looking forward to a party she had been invited to near a local landmark called the Craigflower Bridge. Reena was a girl who existed in the difficult space between two very different worlds. Inside her home on Gorge Road, her life was defined by the strict but loving traditions of her family. Her parents, Suman and Manjit, were devout and hardworking people who had raised Reena and her siblings with a clear set of values. They lived in a comfortable house in a neighborhood where the lawns were perfectly manicured and the streets were lined with blooming flowers. To her family, Reena was a girl with a bright smile and a sensitive heart, someone who loved music and cared deeply about her heritage. She was their eldest daughter, and they viewed her as a bridge to their future in Canada. But outside the front door, the world felt much colder and more complicated. Reena was a South Asian girl, growing up in a predominantly white, affluent suburb in the late 1990s. At 14, she was already struggling with the intense social pressures of middle school. She felt like an outsider in her own town, someone who didn't quite fit the mold of the popular athletic girls she saw in the hallways at Shoreline Secondary School. Reena was self-conscious about her weight and her appearance, and she often felt like her peers were looking through her, or worse, looking at her with a quiet, persistent judgment. She desperately wanted to belong to the groups she saw hanging out at the local malls and parks. Reena valued the idea of being part of a crew, a group of friends who would look out for her and give her a sense of identity that went beyond her family name. In an effort to fit in, she started hanging out with a group of teenagers who called themselves the Shoreline Kids. They were known for being a bit rebellious, spending their Friday nights drinking and smoking under bridges or in empty parking lots. To Reena, they represented a world of independence and coolness that she was dying to enter, even if it meant clashing with her parents' expectations. The conflict at home was becoming more frequent. Reena wanted to wear the baggy clothes and dark makeup that were popular in the grunge and hip-hop scenes of the time, while her parents wanted her to focus on her studies and her faith. She would often leave the house in one outfit and then change into something else as soon as she was out of sight. It was a common teenage rebellion, but for Reena, it was fueled by a deep, aching need to be accepted by the very people who often treated her poorly. She was willing to forgive a lot of slights and insults if it meant she could still be invited to the Friday night gatherings. She spent hours on the phone with her classmates trying to navigate the shifting alliances and petty dramas of the 14-year-old social hierarchy. She was the kind of girl who would give her last dollar to a friend just to see them smile, but she often found that the favor was rarely returned. Reena was resilient, but the constant rejection was starting to take a toll. She began to act out more, sometimes inventing stories about her home life or her past to make herself seem more interesting or more troubled than she actually was. She thought that if she seemed more like the Shoreline Kids, they would finally stop seeing her as a target and start seeing her as a friend. On that Friday in November, Reena felt like she had finally made a breakthrough. She had been told about a party that was happening under the Craigflower Bridge, a massive concrete structure that spanned the Gorge waterway. This wasn't just a rumor, she had been specifically told to be there. She spent the afternoon picking out her best outfit, a pair of dark jeans and a stylish jacket. She felt a surge of excitement as she finished her makeup. This was her chance to prove she was one of them. She told her parents she was going to see a friend and promised to be home by her curfew. She walked out the door with a sense of purpose, unaware that the invitation was not a gesture of friendship, but a coordinated plan for a confrontation. The walk from her house to the bridge took about 15 minutes. The evening air was damp and smelled of sea salt and wet concrete, a typical late autumn night in Victoria. The streetlights cast long flickering shadows on the pavement as Rena made her way toward the water. She was nervous, but it was the good kind of nerves, the kind you feel before something big happens. She reached the bridge around 8 o'clock. Underneath the massive concrete spans, a group of about 8 or 9 teenagers had already gathered. There was music playing from a portable radio, and the air was thick with the smell of cigarette smoke and cheap liquor. As Rena stepped into the area under the bridge, the atmosphere changed instantly. The music didn't stop, but the conversation died down. The group, mostly made up of teenage girls she knew from school, didn't greet her with a welcome. They formed a loose circle around her, their faces illuminated by the dim orange glow of their cigarettes. Rena tried to make a joke to break the tension, but nobody laughed. She noticed that the girls were looking at each other, nodding as if they were following a script she hadn't been given. This was the first small deviation from what she had expected. This wasn't a party, it was a tribunal. The leader of the group, a girl who had been at the center of many of the school's social disputes, stepped forward. She accused Rena of stealing a boyfriend and spreading rumors about her online. Rena tried to defend herself, her voice shaking as she realized how outnumbered she was. She looked around the circle for a friendly face, but she only saw a cold, collective boredom. These were girls she had tried so hard to befriend, girls she had shared her secrets with, and now they were looking at her like she was an obstacle that needed to be removed. The pressure in the small space under the bridge began to rise as the insults became more personal and more aggressive. The situation reached the point of no return when one of the girls stepped closer and stubbed out a lit cigarette on Rena's forehead. The physical shock was immediate, but the psychological shock was worse. It was the signal the rest of the group had been waiting for. Within seconds, the group turned into a swarm. They began to hit and kick Rena, pulling her hair and dragging her toward the muddy ground. The logic of the group had taken over. A pack instinct where the individual teenagers disappeared into a single violent force. Rena tried to cover her face, but there were too many of them. She was being swarmed by her peers in a place where nobody could see or hear her. The attack was sustained and brutal. Rena was knocked to the ground multiple times, her dark jacket becoming soaked with mud and water. She was being punished for wanting to belong, for being different, and for simply being there. The teenagers, some of whom were as young as 12, seemed to be feeding off each other's energy. Every blow was followed by a laugh or a taunt. Rena managed to find a moment of strength and scrambled to her feet, breaking through the circle and running toward the road. Most of the group stayed behind, laughing and talking as if nothing significant had happened. They thought they had sent a message, and they were satisfied. But two of the teenagers, a girl named Kelly and a boy named Warren, were not finished. As Rena crawled away, bruised and bleeding, trying to make her way back to the safety of Gorge Road, they followed her. They caught up to her near the water's edge, far enough away from the others that they were now alone. Rena was exhausted and in shock, her body reaching its limit. She looked up at them, perhaps still hoping for a moment of mercy from the people she had once called friends. Instead, they began a second assault that was even more violent than the first. They beat her until she was unconscious, and then they dragged her body into the cold, tidal waters of the Gorge waterway. Rena's parents reported her missing that night when she didn't return by her curfew. For the next 8 days, the community of Saanich was on edge. The police initially treated it as a runaway case, assuming a rebellious 14-year-old had just decided to stay out for a while. But Suman and Manjit knew their daughter wouldn't just leave them. They organized their own search parties, walking the trails and the parks, calling Rena's name into the dark. The local news picked up the story, and the Shoreline kids were interviewed, but they all stuck to the same story. Rena had been at the bridge, there was a minor scuffle, and then she walked away. They acted as if they had no idea where she was. The search ended on November 22nd, when a police helicopter spotted a body floating in the water near the bridge. It was Rena. The autopsy revealed the horrific extent of the violence she had endured. She had sustained injuries comparable to those seen in a high-speed car crash, and she had ultimately died from drowning. The investigation quickly shifted from a missing person case to a homicide, and the police began to break down the wall of silence that the teenagers had built around themselves. Within days, the truth began to emerge. The Shoreline Six, a group of girls involved in the initial beating, were arrested along with Kelly and Warren. The case of Rena Verk shocked the conscience of the nation. People couldn't understand how a group of normal middle-class kids, most of them girls, could turn into a lethal mob. It triggered a massive national debate in Canada about the nature of bullying, the dark side of teenage girl culture, and the swarming phenomenon where group dynamics override individual morality. Rena became a symbol of the cost of social isolation and the dangers of a society that allows its children to grow up in a landscape of predatory social hierarchies. Her parents, Suman and Manjit, showed an incredible level of grace, eventually meeting with one of the killers, Warren, in an act of restorative justice. Warren Glowatsky, who had been a key participant in the final attack, underwent a radical transformation in prison. He took responsibility for his actions and sought out Rena's parents to apologize. In a move that surprised many, the Verks chose to forgive him, recognizing his genuine remorse and his desire to change. They saw that even in a tragedy this dark, there was a path toward redemption. Kelly, on the other hand, maintained her innocence for decades through multiple trials and appeals, becoming a focal point of the public's anger and frustration with the case. The legal battle lasted for over 10 years, keeping Rena's story in the headlines long after her peers had graduated and moved on. The Craigflower Bridge still stands in Saanich, a massive concrete monument to a night that changed the city forever. The area under the bridge is now better lit and more frequently patrolled, but the smell of wet concrete and the sound of the tidal water still carry the memory of 1997. Rena Verk was a 14-year-old girl who just wanted to be included, who just wanted a Friday night that felt like everyone else's. She was looking for a party, but she found a swarm. Her story remains a staple of Canadian criminology and a cautionary tale about the absolute darkness that can hide behind the faces of the kids next door. The glow of a single cigarette under a concrete bridge was the last thing she saw before the world turned into a swarm. The teenagers went home that night and went to sleep in their comfortable suburban beds while the tide carried Rena away from the life she was so desperate to join. In the end, the invitation wasn't for a party, but for a goodbye that nobody was prepared to say. In May of 1998, on the massive and terrifying landscape known as the Great Shelf of Kanchenjunga, a small group of elite climbers was moving through the thin, frozen air. They were at an altitude of nearly 8,000 meters, a place mountaineers call the death zone because the human body cannot survive there for long. The lead climber of an elite team from Uzbekistan was kicking his boots into the hard crust of snow, focused on the mechanical rhythm of his own breathing. He was the kind of person who felt more at home in the silence of the high peaks than he did in the crowded streets of a city. That morning, his team was only pushing through a routine section of the high-altitude glacier, completely unaware that the mountain was about to live up to its reputation as the most feared peak on Earth. Kanchenjunga is the third highest mountain in the world, standing on the border between Nepal and India. Unlike Mount Everest, which sees hundreds of climbers every season, Kanchenjunga is isolated, massive, and incredibly vertical. To the local people who live at its base, the mountain is not just rock and ice. It is a female deity, a goddess who is said to be the protector of the 5 treasures of the snow. There is an old legend that the goddess does not want women on her summit, and for decades female climbers had either been turned back by storms or lost to the mountain. This legend created a psychological weight that every expedition had to carry. The mountain felt like a forbidden realm, a place where humans were only allowed to stay if they followed the goddess's invisible and unpredictable rules. For the Uzbekistan team, the 1998 season was the culmination of years of intense training. These were men who had spent their entire lives climbing the rugged peaks of Central Asia. They were used to the cold, they were used to the hunger, and they were used to the absolute isolation of high-altitude mountaineering. They were the kind of people who valued the purity of a difficult climb over the fame of a popular one. They had chosen Kanchenjunga specifically because it was a pure mountain, untouched by the commercialization that had taken over other parts of the Himalayas. They spent weeks at base camp, slowly moving supplies up the mountain and acclimating their bodies to the oxygen-deprived air. Their lives were reduced to the simplest possible goals: melting snow for water, checking their oxygen regulators, and keeping their toes from freezing. Among the international teams on the mountain that year was a British expedition that included a climber named Jeanette Harrison. Jeanette was a highly experienced mountaineer who was well aware of the mountain's reputation regarding women. She and the Uzbekistan team shared the same base camp, and over the course of the expedition, they developed a professional respect for each other. They would sit in the mess tent, drinking hot tea and discussing the route ahead. The Uzbekistan team was known for their strength and their steady, unhurried pace. They were not flashy, and they did not take unnecessary risks. They moved with a synchronized discipline that suggested they were a single unit rather than a group of individuals. To the British team watching them, the Uzbekistan climbers seemed like the most capable people on the mountain. The death zone is a place where the logic of the ground world no longer applies. At 8,000 meters, every single step requires several minutes of recovery. Your mind begins to slow down, and your vision narrows until all you can see is the patch of snow directly in front of your face. The environment is so hostile that it feels like the air itself is trying to push you off the mountain. The Uzbekistan climbers moved through this landscape with a clinical focus. They knew that at this height, even a small mistake like a loose crampon or a dropped mitten could turn into a life-threatening crisis. They lived in a world of constant low-level pain, their lungs burning with every shallow breath. Yet they found a strange sense of peace in the mechanical routine of the climb. It was a place where only the most basic truths of physics and biology mattered. The Great Shelf is a sprawling, flat expanse of ice and snow located just below the final summit pyramid. It looks like a safe place to rest, but it is actually one of the most dangerous parts of the mountain. It acts as a massive collector for all the snow and ice that falls from the higher slopes. Because Kanchenjunga receives the full brunt of the moisture from the Indian monsoon, the snow structures on the Great Shelf are notoriously unstable. Massive slabs of ice, some as large as city blocks, sit precariously on the slopes, waiting for a slight change in temperature or wind to send them crashing down. The climbers called these ice falls, and unlike a typical snow avalanche, they do not slide. They shatter like glass and accelerate to incredible speeds. In 1998, the shelf was particularly loaded with fresh, unstable snow. In mid-May, the weather window finally opened. The British and Uzbekistan teams began their final push toward the summit. The air was perfectly still, and the sky was a deep, almost black shade of blue. It was the kind of morning that makes climbers feel like the mountain is finally welcoming them. The Uzbekistan team was moving steadily across the Great Shelf, their bright red and yellow climbing suits standing out against the blinding white snow. They were only a few hundred meters below the summit. Back at base camp, the support staff was watching them through telescopes, tracking their progress as they neared the top. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. The mechanical rhythm of the axes and the steady movement of the team suggested that they would reach the summit by noon. Then the first small deviation occurred. A localized weather shift, one that was too small for the regional forecasts to catch, swept across the upper slopes. It wasn't a major storm, just a sudden 10-minute whiteout that dropped the visibility to zero and caused the wind to gust sharply against the high ridges. To a person on the ground, 10 minutes is nothing. But at 8,000 meters on an unstable slope, 10 minutes is enough time for the mountain to rearrange itself. The sudden gust of wind put just enough pressure on a massive slab of prehistoric ice located several hundred meters above the Uzbekistan team. The slab, which had been holding on by a thread for months, finally lost its grip on the granite beneath. It groaned once, a sound like a distant thunderclaps, and then it began to fall. A member of the British expedition was monitoring the radio at a lower camp when a frantic call came through. It was one of the Uzbekistan climbers. His voice was not panicked, but it had a quality of absolute hollow certainty that made the hair on the listener's arms stand up. He didn't ask for help, and he didn't report his location. He only described what he was seeing in that final moment. He spoke about a blue wall that seemed to occupy the entire horizon, falling toward them from the upper reaches of the summit pyramid. The wall was not snow. It was solid ancient ice, and it was moving with such force that it was creating its own atmospheric pressure wave. The radio signal was clear for a few more seconds, filled with the sound of a deep, roaring vibration, and then it turned into static. The whiteout cleared as quickly as it had arrived. The sun came back out, and the sky returned to its brilliant, deep blue. But when the British team looked up toward the Great Shelf through their telescopes, the scene had changed. The Uzbekistan team was gone. In their place was a fresh, jagged debris field of shattered ice and tumbled snow that stretched for nearly a mile across the shelf. There were no tracks, no gear, and no signs of life. The mountain had simply reached out and erased 4 of the most capable climbers in the world in the time it takes to boil a pot of tea. The sheer scale of the avalanche was so massive that it had wiped out every trace of the expedition's progress. At that altitude and with that much ice, there was no possibility of a rescue mission. The physical reality of an ice fall at 8,000 meters is a form of environmental horror that is difficult to comprehend. The force of the impact is so great that human bodies are often pulverized or buried so deeply that they become part of the glacier's permanent structure. The Uzbekistan climbers were likely killed instantly by the pressure wave before the ice even reached them. For the surviving teams on the mountain, the 1998 disaster was a reminder that Kanchenjunga was not a place for humans. The goddess of the five treasures had collected her toll. The base camp, which had been a place of professional camaraderie just days before, was now a place of heavy, suffocating silence. The Uzbekistan tents sat empty, their flaps fluttering in the wind, a reminder of the men who had been drinking tea there just a week earlier. A few days after the disaster, Jeanette Harrison made a decision. She decided to continue her push for the summit. She knew the risks, and she knew the legend of the goddess, but she felt that the only way to honor the climbers who had been lost was to finish the journey they had started together. She climbed through the debris field on the Great Shelf, her eyes carefully, avoiding any patches of color that might indicate a piece of gear or clothing. As she reached the higher slopes, she noticed a single bright object protruding from the fresh snow near the edge of a crevasse. It was a lone, red climbing boot. It was perfectly intact, sitting upright in the snow, as if it were waiting for someone to put it on. It was a fixed point of reality in a landscape of white chaos. Jeanette reached the summit on May 19th, becoming the first woman to survive the climb and return to tell the story. She had broken the curse of the goddess, but she did so with a heavy heart. Standing on the highest point of the mountain, she looked down at the Great Shelf and the debris field where her friends had vanished. She realized that the mountain did not care about her records or her gender. It was an ancient, indifferent entity that simply existed on its own terms. Her success was not a victory over the mountain, but a temporary permission granted by a force that could take it back at any second. She left a small token on the summit and began the long, dangerous descent, her mind focused on the red boot she had seen in the snow. The bodies of the Uzbekistan climbers were never recovered. Like so many others who have been taken by Kanchenjunga, they remained as permanent fixtures in the ice. Over the decades, as the glacier shifts and the snow melts, remnants of the 1998 expedition occasionally emerge from the frozen depths. A tattered piece of a yellow climbing suit, a shard of a shattered oxygen tank, or a length of frayed rope. These items serve as markers for future climbers, warnings of the power that lives on the Great Shelf. Kanchenjunga remains the purest and most lethal of the 8,000-meter peaks, a mountain that is still climbed by very few and feared by everyone who understands the math of an icefall. The 1998 season is still cited in mountaineering journals as a definitive example of why Kanchenjunga is known as the Killer Mountain. It wasn't a lack of skill or a failure of gear that took the Uzbekistan team. It was the simple, unavoidable reality of being in the wrong place at the wrong time in a landscape that does not accommodate human life. The mountain receives the monsoon, the ice becomes unstable, and gravity does the rest. It is a cycle that has been repeating for millions of years, long before humans arrived and long after we are gone. For those who return from the Great Shelf, the memory of the blue wall and the silence that followed is something that never truly leaves them. The sound of a deep groan from the glacier beneath your feet is the only warning you get. It is a low bone-rattling vibration that tells you the mountain is about to move. If you are lucky, you hear it in time to find shelter. If you are like the Uzbekistan team in 1998, the groan is the last thing you ever hear. The mountain stays behind, isolated and vertical, its white peak reflecting the sun, while its depths hold on to the secrets of the people who tried to trespass in the forbidden realm of the goddess. The red boot remains somewhere in the snow, a small flash of human color in a world of ice, waiting for the next storm to bury it once again. The deep groan of the glacier was the only sound left, a low vibration that felt like the mountain itself was breathing. The sound of running shoes on cold pavement was swallowed by the rustle of paper blowing in the winter wind. But before the street went silent, we have to look at a brilliant student who was hours away from finishing the work of a lifetime. On a cold Friday evening in early December of 1998, in the heart of the Ivy League world of New Haven, Connecticut, a 21-year-old Yale senior named Suzanne Joven was walking through the university campus. Suzanne was the kind of person who always seemed to be moving with a quiet, focused energy, as if she was already 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. That evening, she was in the middle of a completely ordinary end-of-the-week routine, finishing up a long day of academic work and preparing for a quick trip to return a borrowed car before heading back to her apartment for the night. Suzanne was the daughter of two world-class scientists, and she had inherited their precision and their tireless work ethic. She had been born in Germany and moved to the United States when she was young, and by the time she reached her senior year at Yale, she had become the definition of the perfect student. She was brilliant, she was driven, and she was deeply involved in the community around her. To her friends and her professors, Suzanne was someone who was destined for a high-level career in international relations or national security. She spoke multiple languages, she volunteered for local charities, and she maintained a grade point average that most people could only dream of. She lived in a world of old stone buildings, quiet libraries, and intense intellectual curiosity. Her senior thesis was a massive high-stakes project that she had been working on for months. In 1998, most of the world had not yet heard the name Osama bin Laden. But Suzanne was already deep into a study of his network and his growing influence as a terrorist mastermind. She was writing about things that wouldn't be on the front page of every newspaper for another 3 years. She valued the truth, she valued clarity, and she had a reputation for being incredibly meticulous in everything she did. If Suzanne said something was finished, it was perfect. Most of her life was spent navigating the border between the safe, affluent world of the university and the more complicated urban reality of the city of New Haven. She was a leader in the Yale International Relations Association and worked in a university laboratory. She was the kind of person who would spend her Friday nights working on a final draft rather than going to a party. But she was never seen as isolated or lonely. She was beloved by her peers, known for her kindness and her willingness to help anyone who asked. She had a steady boyfriend and a close-knit group of friends who saw her as the person who would eventually change the world. On that particular Friday, December 4th, Suzanne was in high spirits. She had just finished the final draft of her senior thesis, a major milestone that meant she was only months away from graduation. She spent the afternoon volunteering at a local church, helping to organize a holiday pizza party for a group of underprivileged children. She was cheerful and relaxed, joking with the other volunteers, and making sure every child had enough to eat. She left the church around 9 o'clock, heading back to her apartment on Park Street to drop off some items and prepare for the rest of her evening. To Suzanne, New Haven was her home. She knew every street corner and every shortcut between the campus buildings. She felt safe in the neighborhood even at night because the university was her sanctuary. She valued the routine of her walks and the familiarity of the stone architecture. After returning to her apartment, she decided to head out one more time. She needed to return a university station wagon she had borrowed for her volunteer work. She grabbed her keys, her wallet, and the notes for her thesis, which she carried in a neat folder. She walked out into the cold, crisp winter air around 9:30. At 9:55, Suzanne ran into a classmate on the corner of College and Grove Streets. They chatted for a moment, and the classmate later reported that Suzanne looked exactly like she always did, composed, happy, and in a hurry to get where she was going. She told the friend she was headed to return the car, and then intended to spend the rest of the night getting some sleep. There was no sign of distress, no sense that she was being followed, and no indication that anything was wrong. She was just a senior at the end of a long week, looking forward to a quiet Saturday morning. The distance from where she was last seen to where she lived was short, and the route passed through one of the most prestigious and well-monitored residential neighborhoods in America. But somewhere in the next 20 minutes, the logical and safe world of Suzanne Joven completely collapsed. At 10:15 p.m., only 20 minutes after she had waved goodbye to her friend, a couple walking through the East Rock neighborhood, about 2 miles from the main Yale campus, heard a series of sharp, panicked screams. They followed the sound to the corner of Edge Hill Road and East Rock Road, an area known for its beautiful mansions and affluent residents. There, lying on the cold pavement under the bright glow of a street lamp, they found Suzanne. She had been stabbed 17 times in the back and the neck. The attack was so fast and so violent that there were no signs of a struggle. Her wallet was still with her, and her expensive watch was still on her wrist, ruling out a simple robbery. But scattered across the asphalt next to her like fallen leaves in the winter wind were the pages of her thesis notes. The brilliant, forward-thinking research she had spent months compiling was now rustling in the street, stained with her blood. The discovery sent a shockwave through the entire Ivy League community. The idea that a Yale senior could be abducted and murdered in such a short window of time in such a secure neighborhood felt like a glitch in reality. The police arrived and cordoned off the scene, but the investigation was a disaster from the start. They didn't find a weapon, and because of the brutal nature of the crime, they immediately began looking for someone who had a personal connection to Suzanne. They couldn't imagine a random stranger carrying out such an intimate and savage attack on a student who had no enemies. Within days, the focus of the investigation narrowed onto one man, Suzanne's thesis advisor, a popular and well-respected professor named James Van de Velde. The logic of the police was that since she was writing a thesis for him and had been seen leaving the campus around the time of the murder, he must be involved. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, no DNA, no weapon, and no witness who saw him anywhere near the East Rock neighborhood that night. But the media circus began, and the university eventually placed him on administrative leave. His life and his career were systematically destroyed by the suspicion. As the years went past, the case against the professor began to crumble. Forensic experts realized that the DNA found on Suzanne's fingernails and clothing did not match Van de Velde. In fact, it didn't match anyone in the national database. The investigation had been so focused on the one person they thought was a suspect that they had ignored other leads. Witnesses eventually came forward with stories that had been pushed to the background during the early days of the case. One person reported seeing a brown van idling near the spot where Suzanne was last seen, with a man in a white shirt seen in a frantic argument with a woman who looked like Suzanne. Another witness heard the sound of running shoes hitting the pavement just after the screams, followed by the roar of an engine speeding away. But because the police had spent so much time on the professor, the trail of the brown van and the man in the white shirt had gone cold. The 20-minute void between 9:55 and 10:15 remained a total vacuum of information. How did a girl who didn't have a car at that moment end up 2 miles away in a residential neighborhood in less than 20 minutes? Was she abducted? Did she get into a vehicle with someone she trusted, or was she lured into a trap? In the years following, 1998 conspiracy theories began to circulate about Suzanne's research. Because she was studying Osama bin Laden and his financial networks years before the rest of the world caught up, some people wondered if she had stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to know. They wondered if the murder wasn't a crime of passion, but a targeted hit related to national security. While there was never any proof for these theories, they added a layer of deep state intrigue to a case that was already buried in academic prestige and urban shadows. Suzanne's brilliant mind had become the center of a mystery she could never solve. James Van de Velde was eventually cleared of all suspicion in 2013, but by then 15 years had passed. The real killer was still out there, a ghost in the New Haven system. The Javan Task Force was formed utilizing the best investigators in Connecticut and the latest in forensic technology. They looked at every piece of evidence again, from the orange fibers found on her clothes to the unique pattern of the knife wounds. They used modern genetic genealogy to try and find a family match for the mystery DNA. But as of 2026, the results have remained frustratingly inconclusive. The murder of Suzanne Jovan remains the most enduring and disturbing mystery in the history of Yale University. It is a case that highlights the border between the safe ivory tower world of the Ivy League and the unpredictable reality of the city streets. Suzanne was a girl who did everything right, who worked harder than anyone else, and who had a future that was almost visible on the horizon. But in a 20-minute window on a cold December night, all of that was taken away, leaving behind only the sound of paper rustling in the wind and the unanswered questions of a family and a city. The streetlights in East Rock are still bright, and the stone buildings of Yale still stand as a monument to academic excellence. But for those who remember 1998, the silence of the campus at night feels a little bit heavier than it used to. They remember the girl with the thesis notes, the one who was looking at the future while everyone else was still living in the past. And they remember that even in the most prestigious and well-monitored places in the world, there are voids that can swallow a person whole in the time it takes to walk a few city blocks. The sound of running shoes on cold pavement was swallowed by the rustle of paper blowing in the winter wind. The investigation continues, and the task force still meets, but the man in the white shirt and the brown van remain figures in a dream that nobody can quite remember. Suzanne Jovan's research was finished, but the story of her final 20 minutes is a draft that will likely never be completed. The smell of burning sulfur and the soft sound of falling ash was the only thing left on the mountain. But before the ash buried the tents, we have to look at two hikers who ignored every warning in pursuit of a god. In the summer of 1997, on the smoking gray slopes of Mount Merapi in central Java, Indonesia, two young men were making their way through a dense thicket of fern and volcanic rock. They were in their mid-20s, the kind of adventure seekers who believed that boundaries were suggestions rather than laws. That afternoon, they were in the middle of a forbidden climb, having bypassed a military blockade designed to keep civilians away from the world's most active and unpredictable volcano. The air around them was thick and heavy, carrying the faint metallic scent of ozone and the unmistakable smell of sulfur. Merapi stood like a jagged gray tooth against the lush green landscape of the island, a constant reminder of the prehistoric fire that lived just beneath the surface. To most people, the mountain was a threat to be monitored from a distance. But to these two men, it was a siren call, a vertical puzzle that they felt uniquely qualified to solve. One of the hikers was a man who had spent his entire adult life seeking out the most dangerous terrain the Indonesian archipelago had to offer. He was a steady, experienced climber who had summited nearly every major fire mountain that formed the backbone of Java. To him, Merapi was not just a geological feature, it was a living entity, a god known as the Fire Mountain that required a specific kind of devotion. He was the kind of person who found more comfort in a sleeping bag than in a bed. His partner was equally obsessed with the vertical world. They shared a bond built on thousands of meters of vertical gain and the shared silence of a summit at dawn. They valued the challenge of what the locals called the red zone, the area near the crater where the earth feels thin and the air tastes like copper. They weren't reckless in their own minds. They were students of the mountain, believing they could read the subtle shifts in the steam and the vibration of the ground beneath them. They grew up listening to the stories of Mba Marijan, the legendary gatekeeper of Merapi. Marijan was an old man who lived on the slopes and claimed to speak for the mountain itself. He often warned that Merapi would only take those who did not respect its power. The two hikers felt that by bypassing the military and moving quietly through the brush, they were showing a different kind of respect. They wanted to see the glowing lava dome without the interference of tourists or authorities. They carried professional cameras, several rolls of high-speed film, and a leather-bound diary to record every detail of their trespass. They were the kind of men who documented everything, believing that a moment wasn't truly lived unless it was captured. They spent months planning this specific route, studying satellite images and old topographical maps to find the one path that the military patrols didn't monitor. They were looking for an unfiltered experience with the heart of the earth. In their previous climbs, they had developed a mechanical routine that kept them safe. They moved in silence, saving their energy for the steep inclines and the thin air. They checked their gear at every rest stop, ensuring their ropes were coiled and their water supplies were secure. They were used to the physical toll of the ascent, the way the leg muscles burn and the lungs struggle to find oxygen. For them, this pain was a sign of progress, a price they were happy to pay for the view. As they moved higher, the lush jungle began to die away, replaced by a landscape of charred wood and volcanic ash. This was the transition into the dead zone, where the heat from the ground prevents anything from growing. The soil beneath their boots felt warm, and in some places, small wisps of white steam escaped from cracks in the rock. They were walking on a thin crust of stone that sat directly above a chamber of molten rock, and they could feel the mountain vibrating. The climb was grueling even for men of their experience. The slopes were covered in loose volcanic scree, a mixture of ash and small stones that made every step a struggle. For every 2 feet they climbed, they would slide back one. The sun was intense, reflecting off the gray rocks and making the air feel like an oven. Yet they pushed on, fueled by the sight of the massive plume of smoke that rose from the summit ahead of them, a white pillar that seemed to touch the sky. They reached the upper slopes late in the evening as the sun was setting behind the jagged western rim of the crater. The sky turned a deep bruised shade of purple, and the smoke from the volcano took on a golden glow. They decided to set up a small, inconspicuous camp in a rocky depression just below the summit. They didn't use a tent, opting instead for simple bivy sacks that would keep them hidden from any nighttime patrols, using binoculars from the valley below. In the diary that would be found much later, the entry for that evening was filled with a strange, breathless excitement. They wrote about the way the stars looked through the volcanic haze, appearing larger and brighter than they did from the ground. But they also wrote about something that wasn't scientific. They mentioned a pulsating rhythmic light coming from deep within the volcanic vents, and a sound that resembled human voices whispering in the wind. They weren't afraid. They described the voices as comforting, like a low humming that vibrated through the rock and into their very bones. They speculated that the mountain was trying to communicate with them, welcoming them into the forbidden space. They spent hours sitting at the edge of the crater, watching the glowing red lava at the bottom of the pit. They took dozens of photographs trying to capture the way the liquid stone moved like water in a boiling cauldron. As the night progressed, the mountain began to change its behavior. This wasn't a massive explosive eruption that would have sent a warning to the monitoring stations in the city of Yogyakarta. It was something much more localized and much more lethal. It began with a series of deep subterranean thuds that the hikers recorded in the diary as the mountain heartbeat. They felt the ground beneath their sleeping bags jump, as if something massive was shifting just a few hundred feet below. Then around midnight, the mountain released a nube ardente. This is a scientific term for an invisible cloud of superheated gas and volcanic ash that moves at over 100 miles per hour. It is a pyroclastic flow that travels silently in the dark, hugging the contours of the ground like a predatory fog. Unlike a lava flow, which you can see and hear, a nube ardente is a ghost. It moves with a terrifying speed, erasing everything in its path with a blast of heat. The hikers would have had no warning at all. 1 second they were sitting in their rocky depression watching the stars, and the next the air itself would have turned into a furnace. The heat of a pyroclastic flow is so intense that it sears the oxygen from the lungs in a single breath. It doesn't burn the skin so much as it carbonizes the body instantly. The two men were likely killed before they could even stand up, caught in a moment of fascination that turned into an ending. When the sun rose the next morning, the military observers in the valley noticed a fresh layer of fine gray ash covering the upper third of the mountain. They saw no signs of life, but they received a frantic report from the families of the two men who had failed to check in via their satellite phone. A search was initiated, but it was aborted almost immediately. The toxic gas levels near the crater had spiked to lethal concentrations, and the ground was actively venting steam. The searchers who attempted to reach the upper slopes were forced to turn back. The ground was still hot enough to melt the rubber soles of their boots, and the air was filled with a dense, acidic fog that made visibility zero. The mountain was effectively defending its secrets. For weeks, the area remained a high danger zone, and the families were told that their loved ones were likely lost. The mountain had integrated them into its own landscape, sealing them under the ash. The searchers realized that anyone caught in that specific sector of the red zone was no longer recoverable. The pyroclastic flow doesn't just kill, it buries. It lays down a heavy, fast-setting layer of volcanic glass and dust that acts like a prehistoric tomb. For the families, the realization was a different kind of horror. There would be no body to bury and no site to visit. Their sons were now part of the geology of Java, turned into stone by the mountain they loved. Nearly a year later, in 1998, a massive shifting of the lava dome caused a localized landslide on the northern slope. As the gray stone and ash crumbled away, a recovery team performing a routine inspection found something protruding from the rubble. It was the corner of a metal cooking kit. They began to dig, and as they cleared the debris, they found the remains of the campsite that had been established in the summer of 1997. They found a tattered sleeping bag, a pair of boots, and a camera that had partially melted into the volcanic rock. The lens had turned into a pool of black glass, and the internal mechanisms were fused together. But right next to the camera, they found the leather-bound diary. The edges of the cover were charred and brittle, but because it had been buried in a dry, sterile environment of volcanic ash, the paper at the center was perfectly preserved. The investigators took the diary back to the station and began to translate the final entries. What they found was a chilling redefinition of the entire event. The hikers hadn't been trying to run away when the activity increased. They wrote that the lights in the crater seemed to be mesmerizing, and they felt a physical pull to get closer to the edge. The very last line suggested they were planning to move their camp even closer to the rim to see what they called the beings of the fire. They weren't fleeing a disaster, they were walking directly into the heart of it. They had become so obsessed with the mountain's mystery that they had lost their sense of self-preservation. They believed they were guests of the volcano and that the heat and the gas were part of a welcoming ceremony. The diary ended with a description of the air turning a brilliant glowing red, a sight they found beautiful rather than terrifying. It was the last thing they ever wrote. The investigators realized that Merapi isn't just a fire mountain, it is a master sculptor. It preserves its victims in a casing of stone, turning their tragedy into a permanent part of the landscape. The melted camera was a testament to the absolute heat of the nube ardente, a force that can turn plastic into liquid in seconds, while leaving a paper diary intact if the conditions are right. The mountain had essentially erased the men and replaced them with a layer of silent glass. The summit remains a high-danger zone today, and the 1997 case is the primary reason for the permanent ban on hiking during activity peaks. The story of the silent hikers is told to every person who attempts to bypass the military blockades. It is a reminder that the mountain does not care about your experience or your intentions. It is a living God that expects to be left alone, and it has a very violent way of enforcing its privacy on the slopes. The smell of burning sulfur and the soft, heavy sound of falling ash is the only thing that remains on the upper slopes. It is a sound that mutes everything else, a gray curtain that falls over the world and hides the things that should never have been seen. In the silence of the crater, the mountain continues to breathe indifferent to the lives it has claimed and the diaries it has sealed in its own stone heart. The hikers are still there, somewhere under the rock. The smell of sulfur was all that remained, a soft falling of ash that muted every sound on the mountain. The sound of a sliding van door was the last thing the street ever heard of him. But before the van arrived, we have to look at a poet who believed that words were the only weapon he needed to change the world. In late January of 1998, in the chaotic and sweltering urban sprawl of Jakarta, Indonesia, a 34-year-old man named Wiji Thukul was walking down a narrow, crowded side street. Wiji was the kind of person who seemed to blend perfectly into the backdrop of the working-class neighborhoods he called home. He was thin, with a slight frame and hands that were roughened by years of manual labor. That afternoon, he was moving through the city with a quiet, practiced caution, his eyes constantly scanning the traffic as he looked for a specific face in the crowd. He was a man who lived in the shadows of a changing nation, but he wasn't a criminal or a soldier. He was a poet, and that day he was in the middle of a completely ordinary attempt to find a safe place to sleep as the world around him began to burn. Wiji grew up in a small, cramped house in Solo, Central Java. He was the eldest son of a pushcart peddler, and his childhood was defined by the hard, honest struggle of the Indonesian working class. He was the kind of kid who saw the world through the lens of those who were often ignored by the people in power. He dropped out of high school because his family couldn't afford the fees, and he spent his youth working as a carpenter and a laborer. But Wiji had a gift that set him apart from the other workers in the neighborhood. He had a way with words that was sharp, direct, and incredibly powerful. He didn't write about romance or nature. He wrote about the price of rice, the heat of the factories, and the quiet dignity of the people who built the country but were never invited to the table. He was a family man at heart, deeply devoted to his wife, Siti Daya Sujira, whom everyone called Pony M. They lived in a tiny house where the walls were covered in scraps of paper, and the floor was often cluttered with his children's toys. Wiji valued the simple stability of his home life, finding his greatest inspiration in the daily conversations he had with his neighbors and the shared struggles of his community. He was the kind of father who would spend his last few coins on a book for his daughter, believing that education and art were the only ways to break the cycle of poverty. He wasn't interested in fame or wealth. He only wanted his words to serve as a voice for the voiceless. He became a legend in the underground art scene, a man who could turn a political protest into a gathering of souls with a single verse. For over 30 years, Indonesia had been ruled by a single man and a single military regime known as the New Order. It was a world of strict rules and heavy surveillance, where the streetlights were bright but the political shadows were incredibly deep. In this environment, Wiji Thukul's poetry was considered more dangerous than a stockpile of weapons. His most famous line was simple: there is only one word, resist. He didn't use complicated metaphors or academic language. He spoke the language of the streets, and because of that, his poems began to spread like wildfire through the factories and the universities. He was a man who believed that if you could make people feel their own worth, the regime would eventually lose its grip. He was a leader who didn't want to lead only to empower. His life was a constant game of cat and mouse with the authorities. He was arrested multiple times and beaten so badly that he partially lost his sight in one eye. But every time he was released, he went right back to the streets, his voice louder than it had been before. He was the kind of man who couldn't be silenced, because his poetry didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to the millions of Indonesians who were tired of living in fear. Poniam lived in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing if the knock on the door would be her husband coming home or the police coming to take him away. They developed a series of signals and safe houses, a secret geography of survival that allowed Wiji to keep writing even when he was a wanted man. He valued his freedom, but he valued his integrity more. In the summer of 1996, a major political event known as the July 27th incident occurred in Jakarta. A military raid on an opposition headquarters triggered massive riots and a nationwide crackdown on activists. Wiji was identified as a primary instigator, and he was forced to go into total hiding. For nearly 2 years, he moved from city to city, living in windowless rooms and sleeping on concrete floors. He became a ghost, a name whispered in student meetings, and a face on a black and white poster in the police stations. He missed his wife and his children with an ache that was almost physical, but he knew that returning home would mean certain death or imprisonment. He kept writing, sending his poems through a network of trusted couriers, his words acting as the heartbeat of the growing resistance. By late 1997, the air in Indonesia felt heavy and stagnant. The regional economic crash had hit the country with a force that nobody expected. The value of the currency plummeted, prices for basic goods tripled, and the long-simmering frustration of the people began to reach a boiling point. Luigi was back in Jakarta, moving through the chaotic urban sprawl, trying to coordinate with other activists. The city was a maze of traffic, street vendors, and military checkpoints. He felt the rising pressure every day. It wasn't just the police anymore. There were rumors of secret units and unmarked vehicles snatching people off the streets in broad daylight. He moved with a heavy backpack and a worn notebook, a man who carried his entire world on his shoulders as he navigated the death throes of a dictatorship. The first small deviation from the usual pattern of surveillance occurred in early January. Several of Luigi's colleagues, young students and organizers he had known for years, began to vanish. These weren't public arrests where the families were notified. These were disappearances. A man would go out to buy a newspaper and never come back. A student would leave a library and simply be erased from the world. Luigi noticed that the same unmarked white vans were being seen idling near activist meetings and university gates. The vans had tinted windows and no license plates, or plates that didn't belong to any government agency. It was a new kind of horror, a clinical and silent method of removing people that made the old-fashioned police raids seem almost honest by comparison. The trigger event for the final phase of the tragedy happened in February of 1998. The protests had moved from the universities to the streets, and the regime was becoming increasingly desperate to maintain control. A specialized and secret military unit, which would later be revealed to the world as the Rose Team or Tim Mawar, was given a list of names. These were the high-value targets, the people whose influence and words were deemed a threat to national security. Luigi Thukul's name was near the top of that list. The Rose Team was a group of elite soldiers trained in asymmetric urban warfare and interrogation. They didn't operate by the laws of the country. They operated by the logic of a phantom prison system where screams were masked by the sound of the city. Luigi was last seen alive in late February by a close friend in a busy Jakarta neighborhood. He looked tired, and his clothes were worn thin, but he was still talking about the future. He mentioned that he was heading to a meeting near the city center and that he would be in touch once he found a new safe house. He adjusted his bag, gave a small tired wave, and walked into the crowd. That was the point of no return. Somewhere between that meeting and his next destination, the white van finally found him. There were no witnesses who could provide a clear account, no frantic struggle that drew the attention of the neighbors. In a city of millions, Luigi Thukul was simply pulled into a vacuum, his voice cut off in the middle of a sentence that the rest of the country was waiting to hear. The discovery and first response didn't happen in a police station or a courtroom. It happened in the quiet, empty chair at Luigi's dinner table in Solo. Poniem waited for the letter, or the courier that always eventually arrived, but this time there was only silence. As the weeks turned into months, she began to realize that something had changed. In May of 1998, the regime finally collapsed under the weight of massive riots and international pressure. The dictator stepped down and the transition to a new era began. The new government began to release the political prisoners who had been held for years. Poniem stood at the gates of the prisons, looking at the faces of the men walking out into the sun, waiting for the thin man with the slight frame and the revolutionary eyes. But Luigi never walked through those gates. The aftermath revealed a terrifying reality. As the released activists began to speak out, they told harrowing stories of being held in windowless, soundproof rooms in secret locations across Jakarta. They described being blindfolded for weeks at a time, being tortured for information, and hearing the muffled sounds of other men in the rooms next to them. They spoke of the Rose Team and the clinical precision of their abductions. Out of the 23 activists who had been snatched in those white vans, 9 were eventually released. 1 was found dead, but 13 of them, including Luigi Thukul, were still missing. They weren't in the official prisons and they weren't in the hospitals. They had become the disappeared, a group of men who were neither dead nor alive in the eyes of the law. A redefining clue emerged during a human rights investigation in the early 2000s. It was revealed that the Rose Team had operated a network of safe houses that were so well hidden they were never discovered by the public during the unrest. These were the phantom prisons where the scream of an activist was just a vibration against a concrete wall. The investigators realized that the 13 missing men were likely killed in these houses during the final days of the regime, their bodies disposed of in ways that were designed to ensure they would never be found. Luigi Thukul had been snatched, not to be interrogated, but to be deleted. The regime understood that as long as the poet was alive, his words would continue to be a threat. They wanted to kill the man and the memory at the same time. The final tightening before the truth came out happened when the families of the missing began to organize. They realized that the new government was hesitant to fully investigate the military units involved. Every Thursday, a group of people, mostly mothers and wives, began to gather in front of the presidential palace in Jakarta. They wore black clothes and held black umbrellas, standing in total silence for 1 hour. This became known as the Kamisaro, or the Thursday protests. They weren't asking for money or political power. They were only asking for a simple truth. Where are our sons? Where is my husband? Poniem was often at the front of that line, holding a black umbrella in the tropical rain. A woman whose life had become a permanent act of waiting for a man, who was last seen walking into a Jakarta crowd in 1998. The climax of the story is the ongoing unresolved legacy of the missing 13. While some of the soldiers involved in the Rose team were eventually tried and sentenced, the high-ranking officials who gave the orders remained in positions of power for decades. The location of Wiji Thukul's remains is still a state secret, a piece of information buried in a classified file that nobody is willing to open. In the eyes of the law, Wiji is still officially a missing person, a liminal ghost who exists in the space between the old world and the new. His children grew up without a father, and his wife grew old in a house that still feels like it's waiting for a knock on the door. The mystery of the white vans is the central black hole in the history of modern Indonesia. The final truth revealed is that while the regime managed to delete the man, they failed to delete the words. Wiji Thukul's poems are still recited in every protest and every university across the country. His famous line, only one word, resist, is spray-painted on the walls of Jakarta and Solo, a permanent reminder of a man who fought a dictatorship with a notebook and a lead pencil. He has become a martyr for a nation that is still trying to reconcile with its own violent past. The 13 who disappeared remain the most haunting symbol of what happens when a government decides to treat its own citizens as obstacles to be removed. They are the souls who paved the way for a democracy they never got to see, lost in a network of phantom prisons that the world has tried to forget. The case remains a major human rights black hole, a tragedy that is both political and deeply personal. To this day, the families still gather every Thursday with their black umbrellas, a silent and powerful witness to the crimes of 1998. They are a reminder that a person cannot be truly erased as long as there is someone left to ask their name. Wiji Thukul's poems continue to be published and read by new generations, his voice reaching across the decades to remind a changing nation of the cost of its freedom. The white vans may have taken the poet, but the poetry remains as a permanent part of the Indonesian landscape, a voice that the shadows could never truly swallow. The sound of a sliding van door was the last thing the street ever heard of him. The van pulled away and vanished into the heavy Jakarta traffic, leaving behind a crowd of people who were too busy trying to survive to notice that a poet had just become a ghost. In the end, Wiji Thukul was right. His words were more dangerous than a stockpile of weapons, because even in the silence of a phantom prison, the truth has a way of finding its way back to the light. The sound of a sliding van door was the last thing the street ever heard of him. We have spent a lot of time today in the years 1997 and 98. It was a strange window in history. The world was standing on the edge of a new 1,000 years, looking forward to technology and progress. But as we have seen through these 12 stories, the shadows of the old world were still very much alive. The tragedy is not just in the events themselves, but in the echoes they left behind in our minds. When you close your eyes tonight, it likely won't be the big explosions or the high-altitude rescues that stay with you. It will be the small clinical details that shouldn't be there. It is the $5.75 found in 39 pockets. That number is too specific to be a coincidence. It represents a level of preparation for a journey that had no destination, a logical answer to an impossible question that remains unanswered. The most unsettling part of these cases is the void. We like to think that time is a solid and continuous thing, but for Dini Haryati and Suzanne Joven, time just stopped. There is a 5-minute gap on a sidewalk in Singapore and a 20-minute gap on a street in New Haven. Those tiny slices of time are where the logic of our reality breaks down. We search for answers in the DNA and the witnesses, but the heavy silence of the night remains. Nature has its own way of being quiet. In the Aokigahara forest, the volcanic rock swallows the sound of your heartbeat. On Mount Merapi, the ash buries the camp in a gray and sterile silence. On Mount Rainier, the wind creates a wall of white that separates you from the rest of humanity. We think we are in control of our environment, but these stories show us that the earth is indifferent to our presence. It does not hate us, it just does not hear us. The horror of Rina Virk and the activists in Jakarta reminds us that the human heart can be just as cold as a mountain peak. There is a specific kind of fear that comes from a group of teenagers turning into a lethal swarm under a bridge. It is the fear that the person standing next to you could lose their individual soul to the logic of the pack. The white van and the concrete bridge are different shapes of the same dark instinct to erase another human being. Then there is the mystery of Frederick Bourdin and the Barclay family. It is a story that makes us question the very nature of truth. How much are we willing to ignore to protect a lie that makes us feel better? The imposter did not win because he was a master of disguise. He won because a family chose to believe him. They saw brown eyes and heard a French accent and decided it was a miracle. Sometimes the greatest monster is our own desperation for a happy ending. The red boot on Kanchenjunga is still there. The orange fibers from Exeter are still sitting in an evidence locker. These physical traces are the only things left of lives that were taken by a sudden turn of events. They are the artifacts of the point of no return. We look at them and we try to find a lesson, but often the only lesson is that the world is a lot more fragile than we care to admit while we are going about our ordinary and comfortable routines. We like to believe that we are the masters of our own identities and the architects of our own security. We build high fences and we install cameras, and we believe that these things will keep the wolves away from the door. But the story of Frederick Bourdin shows us that the door can be opened from the inside by our own need for comfort. A family accepted a man who looked nothing like their lost son because the pain of the truth was far heavier than the weight of a lie. The keyhole cave is perhaps the most visceral reminder of our own physical limits. The idea that every breath out makes the world smaller is enough to make anyone stop and think about the space they occupy. It is a story of geometry over force. It shows us that survival often depends on the calm logic of a stranger reaching into the dark. It is a testament to human resilience, but it also leaves us with the feeling of being trapped in a space that is too narrow for comfort. In Singapore and Exeter, the high hedges and the tropical buffer forests were supposed to be parts of a beautiful landscape. Instead, they became walls that provided cover for a predator. This is the safety paradox. The places that feel the most secure are often the places where we are the most vulnerable because we have lowered our guard. We trust the rhythm of the city and the stability of our neighborhoods, but those things can vanish in the final 5 minutes of a walk. The story of the activists in Jakarta is a reminder that the silence of a government can be just as terrifying as the silence of a forest. The 13 men who disappeared were not just victims of violence, they were victims of a system that tried to delete their existence. The black umbrellas held by their mothers every Thursday are a visual representation of a grief that has no resolution. They are waiting for a truth that is being held behind the sliding door of a white van. Mount Merapi and Mount Rainier show us that the mountain always has the final word. Whether it is a pyroclastic flow or a vertical blizzard, nature does not negotiate. The hikers who went toward the glowing lights and the climbers who were frozen to the rock were all seeking a moment of transcendence. They found it, but at a cost that is difficult to measure. Their stories are preserved in the ash and the ice, serving as warnings for anyone who thinks they can beat the math. Suzanne Joven's scattered thesis notes and Rena Verk's cigarette burn are the kinds of details that stick in the throat. They are the markers of a life that was interrupted in the middle of a thought. We look for a grand narrative or a deep philosophical meaning in these tragedies, but often there is only the cold reality of a struggle that happened in the dark. The aftershock is not in the violence itself, but in the realization of how quickly everything can change. When we look back at 1997 and 98, we see a world that was trying to find its way. We see the beginning of the digital age and the end of old regimes. We see a transition that was marked by a series of events that defy easy explanation. These 12 stories are the anchors of that era. They remind us that no matter how much technology we develop or how many laws we pass, the fundamental human experience of fear and loss remains the same. The psychological lingering of these cases comes from the unanswered questions. Why did the dog run home alone? Who was the man in the white shirt? Where are the missing 13? These questions are the ghosts that live in the evidence lockers and the cold case files. They are the things that keep investigators and families awake at night, looking for a logic that might not exist. The void is not just in the time, but in our understanding of why these things happen. We are all just walking each other home, hoping that the path stays beneath our feet until we reach the front door. We trust the streetlights and the schedules and the people standing next to us. But the lesson of today is that the world is a thin sheet of glass. It is beautiful and it is clear, but it is also incredibly fragile. The fear does not come from the dark. It comes from the realization that the light can be just as deceptive when it is reflecting off a lie. I want you to think about the small things in your own life, the routine of your commute, the safety of your home, and the people you trust. Pay attention to the details that seem out of place. The orange fiber on a jacket or the spinning needle of a compass. These are the things that tell us the truth when the world is trying to tell us a story. Sometimes the smallest detail is the only thing that stands between a routine Tuesday and a point of no return. The stories we have shared today are not meant to scare you through performance. They are meant to remind you of the cost of what happened and the weight of the lives that were lost. The tragedy is sharper when we understand the normal life that came before the collapse. Without that foundation, the ending has no weight. We have looked at the normal lives of 73 people in a forest, 39 people in a mansion, and a poet in a city. They were all just like us. As we close this chapter on 1997 and 98, I want to thank you for spending this time with me. It is a long journey through some very dark places, and it means a lot to have you here in the room. This show is about understanding the real cost of these events and the people who were caught in the middle. If these stories gave you something to think about, I hope you will join us for the next episode as we continue to look into the shadows. Please consider subscribing and leaving a comment to let me know which of these stories stayed with you the most. Your support helps us continue to tell these stories with the respect and the detail they deserve. I would love to hear where you are listening from and what you think about the mysteries we have explored today. Tap the like button if you found value in this deep dive, and remember to look after each other out there in the world. The world is a complicated place, and the shadows are often much closer than they appear. But as long as we keep asking the questions and looking for the small details, we can keep the memory of these people alive. The red boot, the orange fiber, and the black umbrella are all still there waiting for the truth to catch up with them. Until then, keep your eyes open and your ears tuned to the silence. Sometimes the silence is trying to tell you exactly what happened. I appreciate you staying until the very end of this long and difficult journey. It is not easy to look at the dark side of our history, but it is necessary if we want to understand the world we live in today. The year 1998 is now behind us, but the aftershocks are still being felt in every evidence locker and every silent field. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one, where the stories continue to unfold in the dark.